Hello, my friend. Come on in. Find your spot wherever that happens to be tonight. A couch. A bed may be the floor if that is just where you land sometimes. Pull something warm over your shoulders because where we are headed tonight has a real chill in the air. It has been a little while since we last sat together like this, so before anything else, let me just say, I am glad you found your way back 270 years ago. In a corner of England soaked in autumn fog, a farmer's wife stepped outside before the sun had made up its mind to rise. She was listening for one small sound, an apple hitting the grass in the dark. Hidden inside that sound was her family's entire winter quietly deciding itself. Tonight we slip into her orchard, on the last golden days before the frost changes everything. But before we step through that gate together, can I ask you for something small, only if this story earns it though? Somewhere in the next few minutes, if you feel that little pull, that quiet, wait, I need to know what happens to these people feeling, that right there is your cue. Tap the like button, subscribe if you have not already, or leave a comment down below, whatever feels most natural to you. Honestly, it is not really for me. It is more like a note you leave for your future self, and for anyone else who wanders in here later looking for a place to slow down. And while you're there, tell me something. Where are you tonight and what time is it where you are? I check those comments more than you would probably guess, and they mean more to me than you might think. Now go ahead, dim the lights if you can, maybe turn on a fan, or anything nearby that hums softly in the background, something to keep you company through the night. Get comfortable, get warm, and let the rest of your world wait outside the door for a little while. Let's go find that orchard. Picture Somerset in the west of England somewhere in the 1750s. Not the postcard version, not yet. This is Somerset before it ever became a postcard. Rolling hills, still half wrapped in mist. Hedgerows thick and stubborn, growing however they pleased. Smoke rising from a scatter of stone chimneys thin and grey against a sky the colour of an oyster shell. Somewhere in the hedges a robin was already awake, tilting its head at the cold the way small birds do, as though the weather were a puzzle it had not quite decided to solve yet. Not far off stood a grand house called Hestercombe, a home so serious about its cider that the cellars alone could hold several thousand gallons at once, more than most families would see across an entire lifetime. But we are not going there tonight. Near that grand house tucked along its edges sat a much smaller world. A tenant farm, low and sturdy, its thatched roof heavy with the night's dew. This is where we are headed. Not to the big house. Tonight belongs to the people who worked the land that Big House owned. His name was Thomas. 41 years old, hands like old rope. A farmer in the exact way his father had been and his father before that. His wife Eleanor was already awake before he was, which if you asked him was simply how mornings had always gone between them. He had stopped arguing about it around the time they married, mostly because he had never once won. Their daughter Sarah, 12 years old, sharp-eyed and quietly bossy in the way that oldest children so often are. And Ned, 8 years old, who possessed exactly one useful skill this time of year, and that skill was eating apples faster than anyone in the family could count them. That particular morning, the frost had come early. Not the killing kind, not yet, just the season's first cold warning, laid thin and silver across the grass as though something had breathed on the world overnight. Eleanor stood at the door a moment, wrapped in her shawl, watching her own breath curl up into the dark. Before anyone touched a single tree there was bread. Thick, dense, still faintly warm from the night before, torn rather than sliced and passed hand to hand around the low wooden table. Alongside it sat a jug of last year's cider poured into cups that did not match, because in a house like this one nothing ever quite matched. Ned drank his too fast, the way he did everything, and Sarah rolled her eyes at him in the specific, weary way only an older sister truly perfects. Thomas said very little as usual, though he did reach over once and steady his son's cup before it tipped. Some kindnesses do not need words attached to them. Past the fence line, past the low stone wall her husband had rebuilt 3 summers running, sat the orchard. Rows of old, Gnarled trees, some older than Thomas himself, their branches heavy and low, weighed down with fruit that had spent an entire summer quietly turning into something worth fighting for. Spiderwebs stretched between the lower branches, each one strung with tiny beads of frost, catching the light like something a jeweler might have made if jewelers ever bothered with orchards. Here is the part most people picture wrong when they imagine a morning like this one. They imagine hurry, baskets flying, everyone racing the sunrise, but that is not quite how it worked. An orchard does not reward hurry, it rewards attention. Thomas walked the rows slowly that first morning, the way he did every single year, running a thumb along the skin of an apple before deciding whether it was ready, not squeezing. Never squeezing, just a light twist at the stem. If it let go easily, it was ready. If it held on stubborn, it would wait another day. His father had taught him that trick. His father had learned it from someone whose name nobody could remember anymore. "You are doing it wrong," Sarah told her brother not unkindly, watching him wrestle an apple half off its branch with both hands. "You are supposed to twist it, not fight it." "It started the fight," Ned said, mouth already full. Eleanor caught him mid-bite more than once that morning, and each time she simply shook her head, unable to fully hide her smile. Some lessons, it seems, take more than one autumn to properly sink in. Thomas, walking past, only reached out and ruffled the boy's hair, the closest thing to a scolding he ever bothered to give. Beyond their own hedges, the whole valley seemed to be waking into the same quiet labour. A dog barked somewhere down the lane, answered a moment later by another farther off. Smoke thickened over a neighbour's chimney. Somewhere out of sight, a cartwheel creaked slow and patient, carrying someone else's baskets towards someone else's cellar. Harvest, it turned out, was not a private event. It was closer to a shared held breath. Stretched across an entire county, every family bent the same task under the same pale sky. None of them quite alone in it, even out here on the edges of the land. By the time the sun had cleared the hills, the family was spread through the orchard, baskets balanced on hips, breath still faintly visible in the cold air. Sarah worked the lower branches, careful and precise already, a sharper judge of ripeness than her little brother. Though she would never once say so out loud, Thomas took the higher limbs with a wooden ladder that had clearly outlived more autumns than most furniture in the house, its rungs worn smooth and pale where dozens of hands had gripped them before his own. At one point Eleanor climbed halfway up beside him, steadying the ladder more from habit than necessity. She looked up at her husband, sleeves pushed to his elbows despite the cold, and found herself thinking, quietly and without any real reason, of the very first autumn they had spent together in this orchard, years before either child existed, back when the trees felt taller and the mornings felt shorter. He caught her looking and raised an eyebrow, half question, half smile. She only shook her head and passed him up an empty basket. Some things she had learned are better left unsaid and simply understood. The morning wore on the way harvest mornings always did, which is to say slowly and then somehow all at once. Baskets filled, were carried, were emptied, and were filled again. Shoulders that had felt fine at sunrise began to argue by mid-morning. Sarah's fingers turned faintly pink with cold, though she refused to say so, tucking them briefly under her arms whenever nobody was watching closely enough to notice. Ned had long since stopped racing anyone and settled into something closer to actual usefulness, ferrying full baskets back toward the cart instead of emptying them straight into his own stomach. Even Thomas, whose pace rarely changed for anything, paused once to press a hand into the small of his back and exhale slowly toward the pale sky, the kind of breath that carries little more weight than the air around it. And here is something worth sitting with just for a moment. This was not simply fruit picking, not the way we might picture it now, a pleasant weekend outing with a basket and maybe a warm cider donut waiting at the end. For a family like this one, in a century like this one, the apple harvest was survival, quietly dressed up in something that almost looked like joy. Every apple gathered that week was a small piece of insurance against a winter that had not fully arrived yet, but that everyone could already feel leaning against the door. Somewhere in the middle of the morning, a bell rang faintly from the village, marking the hour ordinary and completely unremarkable, except that in a matter of days that same bell would ring for something far bigger, a reckoning of rents, of debts, of who would stay on this land another year, and who would not. But that is a story for a little further along, for now, on this particular morning, the bell was simply a bell and the orchard was simply an orchard, and the family was simply doing what families like theirs had done every autumn for longer than anyone could properly remember. Eleanor paused near the old tree by the gate, the biggest one twisted and strange, its bark rough under her palm. She always paused here every single year just for a moment. Nobody quite knew why, not even Thomas, though he had stopped asking a long time ago. Maybe some trees simply deserve one honest moment of attention, before the basket fills up and the work takes over completely. She looked out over the rows, apples catching the low morning light, golden green and a deep blushing red that no supermarket shelf today would fully recognize. And somewhere underneath the quiet, underneath the cold and the work and the ordinary rhythm of another harvest morning, there was something that almost felt like gratitude. Not the loud kind, the quiet kind, the sort that settles into your shoulders instead of your voice. Because here is the truth this family understood, without ever once needing to say it out loud. Every apple hanging in that orchard was not really the same as the one beside it. Different shapes, different tempers, different purposes entirely, some destined for the table, some for the press, some barely fit for anything but the pigs. It would take an outsider, someone who had never worked land like this, to look at that orchard and see only apples, one indistinct blur of red and green hanging from indistinct branches. Thomas, Eleanor, Sarah, and even young Ned, mid-biters, always knew better than that. To them this orchard was not one thing. It was hundreds of small, separate decisions still hanging, still waiting, each one asking to be understood on its own terms before it was ever allowed into a basket. And that, my friend, is exactly where we are headed next, into a world where no two apples were ever quite the same, and where an entire language once grew up around the differences between them, a language most of us have long since forgotten how to speak. Let's start right there with the language itself, because it really was a language, and like most languages, almost nobody alive today can still speak it fluently. Back in that orchard, Thomas set his basket down for a moment beside the old stone wall and reached for 2 apples at once, one in each hand, holding them up so Sarah could see the difference, without him needing to explain it. The one in his left hand was small, oddly shaped, more green than red, with a bitterness that would have made most modern shoppers wrinkle their nose and put it straight back on the shelf. The one in his right hand was rounder, blushed a deep, almost dramatic crimson sweeter, softer, the kind of apple you eat standing up, juice running down your wrist before you can stop it. This one, he said, lifting the smaller, harder apple, goes to the press. This one, lifting the other, goes to your mother's kitchen. Never mix them up. Ned, half listening while chewing something he almost certainly should not have been chewing yet, asked the obvious question. Why did it matter? An apple was an apple, wasn't it? Thomas only smiled the way a person smiles when they already know they are about to enjoy correcting someone. No, he told him. An apple was never just an apple. Not here. Not in this century. And if you will let me borrow his answer for a moment, I would like to spend the next few minutes proving he was right. Because in an orchard like this, apples were never sorted by simply good or bad. They were sorted by purpose, and there were more purposes than most of us would ever think to invent for a single piece of fruit. There were dessert apples meant to be eaten straight from the hand prized for sweetness and a satisfying crunch. There were cooking apples sharper and firmer, holding their shape in a pot instead of collapsing into mush, exactly what you wanted for a pie that needed real structure. There were keeping apples too tougher, skinned, almost stubborn by nature, the kind that would sit quietly in a cold loft through an entire winter without complaint, actually improving in flavour the longer they waited, as though patience was somehow baked into them. And then naturally there were the cider apples, small and homely, and entirely uninterested in being eaten by anyone existing for a single purpose, and a single purpose only. Have you ever bitten into a piece of fruit from a small farm stand somewhere, something a little strange, looking a little imperfect, and been surprised at how much better it tasted than anything wrapped in plastic at a supermarket? If so, you already understand what nature was quietly doing here centuries before farmers' markets ever existed, refusing again and again to be predictable. Here is where I want to slow down and let a number sit in the room with you, because it tends to surprise people the first time they hear it. England, over the centuries that followed a morning very much like the one we just watched, would go on to develop more than 2,500 named varieties of apple. Not 2,500 trees, 2,500 distinct identities, each with its own name, its own temperament, its own particular reason for existing. Somewhere in the wider world, apple growers everywhere combined push that number past 7,000. Now hold that thought next to this one. Walk into an ordinary supermarket today almost anywhere in Britain or across much of the United States, and you will likely find somewhere between 6 and 8 varieties on the shelf. 2 of them on their own make up close to half of everything sold. We went from a library with thousands of volumes to a display case with a handful of paperbacks, and most of us never noticed the shelves emptying because it happened slowly, one quiet decade at a time. I think about that a lot, honestly. Not just as a piece of trivia, but as something almost a little sad and a little bit human. We are a species that loves a good story about diversity disappearing without anyone meaning for it to happen. Apples, it turns out, were living that story long before anyone thought to write it down. So why so many? Why did one small fruit fracture into thousands of different personalities when a peach stayed mostly a peach and a pear stayed mostly a pear? Here is the part that used to make farmers a little uneasy if they thought about it too hard. Plant an apple seed, any apple seed from any apple you like, and the tree that grows will not be a copy of its parent. It will not even be a close cousin. Every single seed inside an apple carries a completely new, completely unrepeatable set of instructions. Plant 10 seeds from the same tree, and you might get 10 different apples, some wonderful, most forgettable 1 or 2, possibly closer to something you would not wish on your worst enemy. Nature in this one specific fruit seems to have decided that uniformity was boring, which meant that every named variety Thomas ever picked every apple, with an actual title to its name, began as pure accident somewhere. A seed dropped near a fence post, a pip spat out by a farmhand who had no idea history was quietly happening in his mouth. Someone at some point tasted that one unplanned tree and thought, this is worth keeping. And because a seed will not repeat itself, the only way to keep that particular apple alive exactly as it was required, an entirely different trick altogether, one we're going to get into properly in just a little while, because it deserves more room than I'm willing to give it right now. For today, though, let's stay with the names, because the names alone tell you almost everything about the people who gave them. Not far from where our family stood that morning, growers across the West Country were already tending trees called the Golden Pippin and the Bridgewater Pippin, both prized for cider, both carrying the tannin and sharp bite that made a barrel worth waiting for. The trick with a proper cider apple, by the way, had almost nothing to do with sweetness, which tends to surprise people who assume good cider must start from something like a dessert apple. What actually mattered was tannin, that same rough drying sensation you might recognize from an overly strong cup of tea or a red wine poured a decade too early. Tannin gave the finished cider structure something to hold on to on the tongue. Pair that tannin with real sharp acidity, and growers called the result a bitter sharp. Pair it instead with natural sweetness alongside the tannin, and you had what they called a bittersweet. Neither one tasted particularly pleasant fresh off the branch, if we're being honest. Most left your mouth feeling faintly furred, almost chalky. But press them, ferment them, let them sit patiently in a cool barrel through the darker months, and that same harshness quietly transformed into something worth trading, worth arguing over, worth building a regional economy around. Somewhere else, an apple called the Dr. Harvey had been quietly growing in Norfolk gardens since the early 1600s, outliving the man it was presumably named after by well over a century. There was the pearmain, too older than almost anything else in an English orchard, so old that nobody could confidently say who first grew it, only that generations of families had trusted it enough to keep planting it year after year, harvest after harvest. And these were the polite, presentable names. Wander further into the countryside, into smaller orchards kept by people who never expected anyone outside their own parish to hear the fruit's name, and you find something closer to poetry. Apples called things like slack muggirdle, a name that requires absolutely no explanation once you've eaten a few too many. Or pig's snout, named one assumes by someone standing directly in front of one feeling uninspired and entirely too honest. These were not names chosen by scholars in libraries. These were names given by ordinary people who spent their whole lives close enough to these trees to feel entitled to a joke at their expense. I have always found something quietly moving about that. In a world with no photographs, no video, no way to preserve a fleeting harvest morning except through memory and repetition, a name was one of the only forms of permanence available to an ordinary family. Name an apple well enough and it might outlive you by 300 years. Several of them have. There was status wrapped up in all of this too, more than you might expect from something as humble as fruit. In the grandest houses nearby, a perfect unblemished pippin might be displayed on its own small stand at the end of a formal dinner. Polished, admired, occasionally not even eaten, simply appreciated the way you might admire a fine piece of silver. Out here, though, a bittersweet cider apple destined for the press was never expected to look beautiful at all. Nobody minded if it was lopsided, russeted, faintly bruised at the shoulder. Its entire worth lived on the inside in juice nobody would even see until it was already gone. There is something worth noticing in that I think how thoroughly a single fruit could be sorted by the exact same rigid rules of appearance and usefulness that shaped so much of that century already right down to the people standing beneath its branches. Now let's take a short trip across the ocean, because this story does not belong to England alone, not even close. In the early years of the 18th century, on a modest patch of land near what was then called Newtown in what is now part of New York, a single unplanned apple tree grew up on the property of a local landowner. Nobody sat down and designed it. It simply happened the way accidental apples always do. But the fruit it produced turned out to be something special. Firm, sharp, faintly like pineapple, if you caught it at the right week of storage, and famously capable of improving in flavour the longer it sat in a cool cellar rather than fading the way most apples do. Word of that one tree travelled. By the 1750s, colonists were advertising grafted cuttings of it in newspapers up and down the coast. A man you have almost certainly heard of, a printer, an inventor, and eventually a diplomat named Benjamin Franklin, liked the apple so much that in 1759, while living in London, he arranged for barrels of it to be shipped across the Atlantic, just so he could share it with English society. Thomas Jefferson planted dozens of the same trees at his home in Virginia over the following decades, and later, writing home from France, admitted that nothing growing in the orchards of Europe quite compared to the apple he had left behind. It became known eventually as the Newtown pippin, and for a while an apple grown from one unplanned seedling on a small property near New York was considered good enough to send across an ocean as a point of national pride. Isn't that something? An apple doing quiet diplomatic work 2 centuries before anyone invented the phrase soft power. I want you to notice something. These 2 stories share the modest cider apples of Somerset and the accidental pippin of New York. Neither one was created on purpose. Nobody set out to make either of them famous. They were noticed first by ordinary people standing close enough to taste them, and only later did the wider world catch up and start paying attention. Maybe that is worth sitting with for a moment quietly wherever you're listening to this. How many small, unplanned, completely accidental things in your own life turned out years later to matter more than anything you actually planned? I would honestly like to know if you feel like leaving a thought about it somewhere below before you drift off tonight. Back in the orchard, Thomas had already moved 3 trees further down the row, apparently done philosophizing for the morning, though Eleanor, watching him from a distance, suspected he thought about these things more than he ever let on. Sarah trailed behind him with her basket sorting almost instinctively now small, hard, greenish apples in one pile, the soft, blushing ones in another, an entire inherited system of knowledge passing quietly from one generation to the next, without either of them ever calling it that. And that really is the heart of what made an 18th century orchard so different from the tidy uniform rows most of us picture when we hear the word today. It was not one crop. It was hundreds of small individual decisions still hanging on branches that had been chosen one grafted twig at a time by people who understood something we've mostly stopped bothering to ask. Not simply which apple tastes best, but which apple belongs in which basket for which purpose, on which particular morning. Because here is the quiet problem sitting underneath everything we've talked about so far. If no apple seed grows true to its parent, if every single one is a genetic roll of the dice, then how did a family like Thomas's ever manage to keep the good apples good year after year, generation after generation, without the entire orchard sliding back into random chance the moment the old trees finally gave out? The answer to that question is not simple, and it is not something you can rush. It involves patience. Most of us have completely lost the habit of practicing a peculiar little piece of garden surgery, passed down almost like folklore and trees planted by people who would never live to taste their own harvest, which is exactly where we're going to walk next, right into the roots of the thing, quite literally, and into one of the strangest, most quietly beautiful tricks 18th century farmers ever learned to perform with nothing more than a sharp knife and a steady hand. So about that knife I promised you, let's actually talk about what it was for. By mid-morning, Thomas had wandered toward the far edge of the orchard, past the older trees to a much younger one standing alone near the hedge line, barely taller than Ned himself. Its trunk was still smooth, still thin enough to wrap a hand around, and about a third of the way up there was a strange thickened scar running around it, almost like a knot tied too tightly and left to heal that way. Ned had asked about it every autumn for as long as he could remember, and every autumn Thomas gave him some version of the same answer. This year he finally sat down on the grass beside it and gave him the whole thing. That scar, he explained, was where 2 separate trees had become one, not by accident, not by nature simply doing as it pleased. A person had done that deliberately with a sharp blade and a steady hand years before Ned was even born. Here is where I need to circle back to something we left hanging a little earlier, because it is the whole reason this scene even exists. An apple seed, remember, never grows into a copy of its parent tree. Plant the pip from the finest apple you've ever tasted, and the tree it becomes is essentially a stranger, unpredictable, possibly wonderful, more likely disappointing, which left growers across the whole of the 18th century with an uncomfortable little puzzle. If you found one truly excellent tree, one apple worth building a reputation around, how on earth did you make more of it? exactly as it was without simply rolling the genetic dice all over again? The answer, it turns out, is almost unsettling in how simple it sounds, and almost miraculous in how well it actually works. You take a small cutting, just a single season's growth from the exact tree you wish to copy. This is called the scion, and it carries within it the complete unchanged identity of the parent. Every trait, every flavour locked inside a twig barely the width of a finger. Then you take a separate young tree, usually one grown plainly from an ordinary seed, valued not for its fruit but for its strong healthy roots. This one is called the rootstock. You cut both pieces at a matching diagonal angle, slice a small interlocking tongue into each cut, so the two halves lock together almost like a key finding its groove. Press them firmly against one another and bind the wound tightly with strips of cloth, sometimes sealed further with a paste of clay or wax to keep out the weather. And then, quite remarkably, if the two pieces are pressed close enough and the season is right and a little luck cooperates, they simply heal together. Two separate trees become one single unified organism, the roots doing the unglamorous underground work of survival, the grafted branch above producing fruit that is in every meaningful sense identical to the original tree it was cut from. Not a cousin, not a similar variety. The very same apple grown on borrowed roots. Thomas pulled a spare twig from his coat pocket, the kind he apparently carried without anyone quite noticing, and pressed a small folding knife into it to show the angle guiding Ned's smaller hand along the same line so he could feel exactly where the blade wanted to travel. Ned predictably pressed too hard on his first attempt, and nearly took the top off his own thumb, instead of the twig earning a sharp laugh from Sarah that she did not even try to disguise as sympathy. Eleanor, without looking up from the row she was working, called out that if he lost a finger before dinner, he could explain it to her personally. Thomas only steadied the boy's wrist and told him quite calmly that everyone bled a little the first time. It was practically part of the lesson. Farmers in this century did not fully understand the biology behind why this worked, not the way we might explain it now with talk of cambium layers and vascular tissue quietly fusing together beneath the bark. What they understood instead was proof, repeated proof passed down from a father's hands to a son's, refined slightly with every generation that tried it. And here is a detail I find rather wonderful if you enjoy the idea that ordinary history often has a paper trail nobody expects. Grafting was not some obscure secret whispered between orchard keepers. By the early 1730s, a single book had become something close to a household Bible for anyone in England who owned so much as a modest garden. Its author, a professional gardener who spent much of his career running London's Physic Garden, had compiled everything he knew into one enormous volume covering nearly every plant a person might wish to grow, fruit trees very much included. Dukes owned a copy. So did ordinary working nurserymen who could barely read half its Latin. It went through edition after edition over the following decades because everyone, regardless of how much land they actually owned, wanted to know how to do exactly what Thomas was demonstrating to his son on that particular morning, which tells you something, I think, about how seriously this century took its trees. This was not idle countryside folklore. This was documented, studied, argued over in print, taken as seriously as anything else considered essential knowledge for running a household, and it was by then already old knowledge inherited rather than invented. Nearly 100 years earlier, a churchman with a scientific streak had sat down and written out in careful detail an entire catalogue of grafting methods, illustrations included, most of which would still look entirely familiar to anyone practicing the craft today. Around the same years, another writer better remembered now for his diaries than his orchards had urged fellow growers to seek out promising scions from wherever they could be found, whichever county, whichever coast, and graft them onto English rootstock without hesitation. Knowledge like this did not stay still. It travelled from garden to garden, county to county, occasionally crossing water entirely, each grower quietly borrowing and improving on whatever the last one had already worked out. Ned, for his part, remained entirely unmoved by any of this. What he actually wanted to know, arms crossed, nursing his thumb slightly, was simpler and considerably more urgent to an 8-year-old. How long, he asked, before a grafted tree like this one actually produced apples worth eating? Thomas told him the truth, because he always did, even when the truth was mildly disappointing. Several years at the very least. Sometimes closer to 6, depending on the tree, the soil, the particular stubbornness of that year's weather. Ned's face did the exact thing every child's face does when handed a timeline longer than their own patience. And Sarah, without even looking up from her basket, informed her brother that he would simply have to survive somehow. I want to sit with that number for a moment because I think it is easy to hear 6 years and let it slide past without really registering what it meant for a family like this one. Plant wheat in spring, and you are cutting it down by late summer the same year, the same season, your effort and your reward sitting comfortably close together. An orchard offered no such comfort. You dug the hole, grafted the scion, watered the sapling through its first uncertain winters, and then you simply waited for years, trusting a process you could not rush, could not argue with, could not bribe into moving any faster. Nor was that waiting entirely passive. A young grafted tree needed real ongoing attention long before it offered anything back. Its thin trunk had to be wrapped or fenced against grazing animals, since a single determined sheep could undo 3 years of careful work in one afternoon of casual chewing. The ground around its base needed clearing season after season, so it was not choked out by whatever else wanted to grow there. Somebody had to notice quietly and consistently whether the young tree was struggling, leaning, or simply failing to thrive long before there was any fruit at all to reward that attention. It was an investment with no dividend for years, made anyway largely on faith, which means quite plainly that a meaningful number of the apples Thomas picked that very morning had not been planted by him at all. They had been planted by his father decades earlier, or in the case of the oldest, most twisted trees near the gate, possibly by someone even further back, a name nobody in the family could confidently supply anymore. Whole rows of the orchard existed purely because someone long dead now had decided to invest 6 patient years into a tree they may not have lived to see mature. Have you ever planted or built or started something you privately suspected you might not live to see finished? Not necessarily a tree. Perhaps a business, a garden, a piece of writing a family. I think there is something worth sitting with in that particular kind of patience, the sort that asks nothing for itself and quietly hands the reward to someone else entirely. Of course not every graft succeeded, and this is worth mentioning honestly, because we tend to romanticize old craftsmanship until it sounds effortless, when in truth it very much was not. A poorly matched cut wood pressed together at slightly the wrong angle, a binding left too loose or too tight, and the whole graft simply failed to take. The scion withered. The rootstock left to its own devices might sprout back on its own, beneath the failed joint reverting to whatever unpredictable seedling apple it had originally carried inside it, undoing years of intention in a single missed season. A skilled grafter was not born knowing this trade. He earned that skill the same way most real skills get earned, through a fair number of quiet private failures nobody ever bothered writing down. This is, I think, part of why a properly established orchard was treated with something close to reverence in a century like this one. It represented not one success, but the accumulated evidence of countless smaller failures that came before it, each one absorbed, corrected, and eventually overcome by someone patient enough to try again the following winter. Thomas himself liked to tell the story whenever anyone let him, of a neighbouring farmer 2 valleys over, who had once bragged rather loudly at market about grafting an entire new row in a single afternoon, twice the usual speed, no wasted motion. By the following spring, nearly every graft on that row had failed, the bindings too hasty, the cuts not quite matched, and the man spent the better part of a decade being gently reminded of it by anyone who happened to walk past his gate. It was not a cruel story the way Thomas told it. It was simply the kind of lesson this century preferred to pass along, wrapped in gossip rather than delivered as a lecture, which somehow made it stick a great deal longer. Not far off, tucked into a corner of Hertfordshire that most of our family would never once visit in their lifetimes, a nursery had opened its gates a handful of years before this particular harvest, in 1735, specialising in exactly this kind of careful, deliberate propagation. It supplied grafted, stock-proven varieties, cuttings taken from trees already known to be worth the wait, sparing a buyer the long uncertain gamble of starting entirely from scratch. Remarkably, that same nursery is still operating today, still sending out scion wood to growers who want a direct living connection to trees first propagated centuries ago. There is something almost startling about that when you think it through properly. A twig cut from a tree in your own garden this year could in theory trace its lineage back through an unbroken chain of grafts to a single tree Thomas himself might have recognised. Eleanor called across the orchard just then, something about the baskets nearest the gate being full enough to carry, and Thomas rose, brushing grass from his knees, resting one hand briefly on the young tree's scarred trunk, the way you might rest a hand on a child's shoulder before walking away. He would not see this particular sapling reach its full height. He knew that plainly, without any particular sadness attached to the knowing. It was simply how an orchard worked. You planted forward into years you would only ever get to imagine. He thought of his own father, then briefly, the way you sometimes do without quite meaning to mid-task hands, still busy with something else entirely. It had been this same man's hands that first guided his decades earlier, along the same diagonal cut on a different sapling in this same orchard, long before Sarah or Ned existed to interrupt the lesson with questions of their own. His father had not lived to see most of these older trees reach the size they were now. And Thomas, walking back toward his waiting family, understood without needing to say it aloud that Ned would likely inherit the same quiet arrangement, one day tending trees planted by hands no longer living for a harvest he himself might never fully witness. Maybe that is worth asking yourself too quietly wherever you happen to be listening tonight. What are you tending right now that will only truly belong to someone who comes after you? There is one more piece of the calendar we have not touched yet, and it was arriving whether this family felt ready for it or not. That faint bell we heard earlier in the morning, ringing out ordinary and unremarkable across the valley, was about to stop being ordinary altogether, because within days the entire rhythm of this family's year would tighten around a single unavoidable date, one that decided far more than which basket an apple belonged in. Right, that date. Let's name it properly, because once you understand what this particular day actually meant, an ordinary church bell stopped sounding quite so ordinary. The 29th of September, Michaelmas. If you have never heard the word before, you're in good company. Most people outside England have not, and even plenty of people inside England only vaguely recall it from old novels or the occasional university term named after it. But in the century we are visiting tonight, Michaelmas was not some quaint footnote. It was one of 4 fixed points that organised the entire rhythm of the year, 4 dates spaced roughly 3 months apart when rents came due, contracts began or ended, debts were settled, and entire households sometimes packed up and moved to a completely different farm before the week was out. The other 3 sat at Lady Day in late March, midsummer in June, and Christmas at the year's close. But Michaelmas, arriving right as the harvest wound down, carried a particular weight none of the others quite matched. It landed at the exact moment a farming family finally knew for better or worse what kind of year they had actually had. Here is the plain arithmetic underneath all of it, and I think it is worth saying out loud rather than leaving it politely unspoken, the way these things so often were at the time. By the later decades of this century, something close to 3 out of every 4 acres of farmland in England was worked not by its owner, but by a tenant, someone renting the ground beneath their own feet from a landlord who might live an afternoon's ride away, or might never visit the property at all. Thomas and Eleanor belong to that larger group. Everything we have walked through so far, the orchard, the old trees, the young grafted sapling, Thomas was so quietly proud of, sat on land that technically belonged to somebody else, which meant Michaelmas was never simply a date on a calendar for a household like theirs. It was a verdict. Historians who study this period have called the exchange of rent between tenant and landlord one of the single largest transfers of wealth in the English countryside before industry, and banking properly took hold more money changing hands on these few fixed days each year than almost anywhere else in ordinary rural life. And where money moves in a system like that, so does anxiety. If you had the coin ready, rent day could actually become something worth celebrating a shared meal, with the landlord's steward a small feast marking another year survived. If you did not, and plenty of families in any given year did not, you approached that same conversation with your stomach in a knot, trying to explain respectfully why the harvest had fallen short and what you intended to do about it. It is worth pausing on how differently this exact date could feel, depending on which side of the ledger you happen to sit on. For the landlord, or more often his steward riding between properties with a leather ledger under one arm, Michaelmas was simply administration, a fixed appointment among several that week, one farm's modest rent, barely distinguishable from the next on the page. For the family actually working that land, it was the entire year distilled down into a single, unavoidable conversation. 2 people could stand in the very same farmyard discussing the very same sum of money and experience the day as 2 completely different events, one a formality, the other something closer to a verdict. Not every family in the parish came through that verdict cleanly either, and it would be dishonest to pretend otherwise. A poor summer, an outbreak of livestock disease, a bad run of luck stacked on top of another bad run of luck, and a tenant might arrive at Michaelmas with simply nothing left to offer. The consequences were not gentle. A family could lose the farmhouse they had lived in for a generation, packing whatever belongings would fit onto a borrowed cart, moving on before the new tenant, sometimes a stranger entirely, arrived to take their place. Neighbours spoke of these things carefully in lowered voices, the way people discuss a misfortune they privately fear might visit their own household next. Eleanor, back in the orchard, was doing exactly this kind of quiet arithmetic in her head as she worked, though nobody watching her sort apples into baskets would have guessed it from her face. She'd learned a long time ago not to let her hands slow down just because her thoughts had wandered somewhere heavier. Can I ask you something while we sit with that for a moment? Do you have a date on your own calendar that carries a similar weight quietly every single year? Not a birthday. Something closer to a reckoning, a tax deadline, a lease renewal, a performance review. You cannot quite stop thinking about weeks before it arrives. I suspect more of us understand this feeling than we might admit out loud, even now, centuries and an entire economic system away from Thomas and Eleanor's particular version of it. Now, this being the 18th century and rural custom being what it was, the reckoning did not always arrive stripped of warmth. Tradition held that a tenant hoping for a little leniency, or simply hoping to stay on the landlord's good side for another year, might arrive at the rent meeting carrying a goose. A properly fattened one, raised specifically with this purpose in mind, offered up alongside the coin as a small edible peace offering. There was even a persistent old story attached to the custom that Queen Elizabeth herself had been sitting down to a plate of roast goose on this very day when news arrived that the English navy had defeated the Spanish fleet, and that eating goose on Michaelmas therefore brought good fortune for the year ahead. Whether that particular tale is entirely true, or has simply been polished smooth by 3 centuries of retelling, I honestly cannot promise you, and I rather suspect nobody fully can. But the goose itself was real enough, and so, apparently, was the small superstition that grew up around its bones. Families would examine the breastbone after roasting, convinced that its colour could predict the coming winter, brown meaning mild weather ahead, a paler bluish tinge warning of something considerably harsher. I find something quietly charming in that particular piece of folk logic, honestly. An entire household studying a discarded bone for clues about the months ahead, the way we might check a weather app today, except with considerably more ceremony and a great deal more goose fat involved. Eleanor, as it happened, had one such goose already fattening quietly behind the house, set aside weeks earlier, for exactly this purpose more or less ignored by the children, except when Ned decided it made an excellent if uncooperative playmate. Whether that particular bird would end up on the family's own table, or travel up the lane toward the landlord's steward, depended entirely on how the coming reckoning went, which meant in its own small feathered way that even the goose was waiting on Michaelmas just as anxiously as everyone else. There is a curious little wrinkle in this date worth mentioning too, one that would only arrive a few decades after our particular morning, though it is too good a detail to leave out entirely. Later in the century, England adjusted its entire calendar, shifting from the old Julian system to the newer Gregorian one, and skipped 11 days outright to make the correction. Rather than simply accept the new date, plenty of stubborn country parishes quietly kept celebrating Michaelmas on the old calculation instead, nearly a fortnight later than everyone else, a tradition some villages apparently held on to for generations afterward. I rather admire that, if I am honest, an entire community deciding quite calmly that the government could adjust the calendar all it liked, but their goose dinner was staying exactly where they had always kept it. Michaelmas carried weight beyond the farmhouse too, out in the wider village. This was traditionally when hiring fairs took place, sometimes called mop fairs. In certain counties, gatherings where labourers without land of their own would stand in the marketplace, each one holding some small symbol of their particular trade, a tuft of wool for a shepherd, a whip for a carter, so that farmers looking for help could walk the rows and simply pick out whoever they needed for the coming year. Imagine that for a moment an entire year's employment decided in a single afternoon based on little more than a look and a brief exchange in a crowded square. If you were chosen, you had work, food, and a roof through the winter. If you were not, you had considerably less certainty than that and precious few other chances until the fair came round again. There is something almost theatrical about it when you picture the scene properly, and I do not think that is an accident. A whole year's fate for hundreds of ordinary people condensed into one crowded, noisy afternoon, standing shoulder to shoulder with strangers waiting to be noticed. Picture for a moment a young farmhand standing in that same crowded square, perhaps 17 or 18 years old, holding a bundle of wool to show he understood sheep, watching farmer after farmer walk past without so much as a glance in his direction. Every hour that passed without an offer was an hour closer to a winter with no wages and no roof guaranteed. And then perhaps a farmer finally stops, asks a few blunt questions, shakes hands on a year's wages and a place to sleep, and just like that, an entire year of that young person's life has been decided by a conversation shorter than the one you and I are having right now. There was no contract lawyer involved, no formal paperwork beyond a handshake, and a shilling passed over as a token of the agreement. Just a look, a question, and an answer that would shape the next 12 months completely. Back at the farm, the household's own harvest customs were winding toward their close as well in a quieter, more private register. Out in the wheat fields nearby, the very last sheaf cut at the end of the grain harvest was often not simply bundled with the rest. It was shaped carefully sometimes by the women of the household, working together in the evening light, twisted and braided into a rough human figure, a corn dolly believed to hold the spirit of the harvest, safely through the empty winter months until it could be ploughed back into the earth the following spring, ensuring the whole cycle would begin again. It was equal parts practical craft and quiet prayer, the kind of small ritual nobody would have called religion exactly, but that clearly meant something all the same. And then there is my personal favourite piece of Michaelmas folklore, mostly because it tells you so much about how ordinary people made sense of an unpredictable world using nothing more than a good memorable story. Past this date country, wisdom insisted you should never under any circumstances eat a blackberry. The reasoning delivered with total sincerity by generations of grandmothers was that on this exact day the devil himself had been thrown down from heaven, landed squarely in a patch of brambles, and left his mark on every blackberry from that point forward by spitting on them out of sheer spite. Whether the actual culprit was a fallen angel, or more plausibly autumn mould, and the first hard frosts quietly turning the fruit bitter, right around this same week the warning did exactly what it needed to do. Nobody in the household got sick from spoiled fruit, and everybody got a slightly better story to tell their children than simply the berries have gone off. Do you have anything like that in your own family? Some small, slightly absurd piece of food wisdom passed down without anyone ever quite explaining where it actually came from? I would be curious to hear it if you feel like sharing before you drift off tonight. What strikes me most, turning all of this over, is how completely a single fixed point on the calendar could organize an entire society's sense of time itself. We tend to think of history as one long, undifferentiated stretch of centuries, but the people actually living through it did not experience their year as a smooth, continuous line. They experienced it in hard, recurring beats 4 times a year, every single year, each one carrying its own particular flavour of hope or dread, depending on how the harvest had gone. Michaelmas was the beat that mattered most to a family like this one because it arrived directly on the heels of the one season that determined almost everything else. We have mostly lost that shared rhythm today, scattered as our own personal deadlines are across 365 separate days instead of 4 communal ones. And yet I wonder whether something useful got lost along with the inconvenience. There was at least a strange kind of comfort in knowing your entire village faced the same reckoning on the same afternoon that whatever anxiety sat in your own chest was quietly mirrored in every farmhouse along the lane. Nobody carried Michaelmas alone. As it happened, this particular year leaned toward the hopeful end of that spectrum. The orchard had been generous. The baskets stacked near the gate told their own quiet story. One Eleanor had already been counting more or less honestly all morning. It would not make the family wealthy. It would very likely make the coming meeting with the landlord's steward considerably less frightening than it might otherwise have been, and in a household like theirs that counted as something close to good news, but none of it, not the rent, not the goose, not even the harvest itself had gathered itself into those baskets by magic. Somebody's actual hands had done every single piece of that work, hour after hour, and if you assumed for even a moment that those hands all belonged to men, I am about to gently correct a fairly common misunderstanding about how a farm like this one truly ran. Let's clear that up properly, because it says something about how easily good history gets flattened by lazy assumption, and because it happens to be one of my favourite corrections to make in this entire story. If you pictured even for a passing second a harvest scene led mostly by men while women stood somewhere in the background stirring a pot, I would gently ask you to set that picture down. It is a comfortable image, familiar from 100 paintings and just as many films, and it is largely wrong. Agricultural historians who have spent years combing through old farm account books, the actual ledgers where a steward recorded who was paid what for which task, found something that tends to surprise people. Across a whole cluster of English estates studied this way, women made up well over half of the entire harvest workforce, better than 55 out of every 100 pairs of hands in the fields during the busiest weeks of the year. That number alone is worth sitting with for a moment because it runs directly against the picture most of us grew up with. Now, I want to be careful here because good history rarely lines up into something tidy, and this particular story is no exception. The work was not simply divided evenly and left at that. Mowing barley and oats with a heavy scythe, the single hardest, highest paid task of the entire grain harvest, was reserved for men almost without exception across the country. But wheat and rye cut instead with the lighter sickle, then raked and bound into sheaves, that work belonged to women, and men equally often for the very same wage. Equal pay on this particular task in this particular century, more common than you might expect, though far from universal. So the honest picture is not one of women standing aside, it is one of a labour system sorted less by gender outright, and more by which specific tool a given task demanded, and who the farm judged strong enough or skilled enough to swing it. Picture it properly for a moment, because it makes a striking scene if you let it. In the wheat field half a mile from where our family stood that morning, men moved through the tall grain in a slow sweeping rhythm, scythes catching the low sun with every pass, the sound less like cutting and more like breathing, steady and unbroken. Behind them came a second line, entirely women and men together, this time sickles flashing quicker and lower, gathering the fallen stalks into bundles before anyone had time to trample them. It was not one workforce, it was two distinct rhythms moving through the same field, sorted by strength and tool, rather than by who happened to be standing where. The equal pay itself, worth adding honestly, was not something every farm in every county practiced with equal generosity. Some estates held firmly to it as ordinary custom, unremarkable and unquestioned. Others quietly paid women less for the very same sickle work and got away with it precisely because so few labourers had any real power to argue otherwise. The picture, in other words, was fairer than most of us assume, though certainly not as fair as it should have been. Which brings us quite naturally back to the orchard, because an apple harvest looked almost nothing like a grain harvest, and I think that difference matters more than it first appears. There was no scythe involved in picking apples. No task here demanded the particular brute strength that mowing did. What it demanded instead was patience, a steady hand, careful eyesight, and the kind of attentive judgment we have already talked about, knowing exactly which apple was ready and which needed one more day on the branch. None of that favoured one sex over the other in any meaningful sense, which is likely part of why an apple harvest in households like Thomas and Eleanor's tended to draw the whole family into the same rows on truly equal footing, rather than sorting everyone by strength, the way the wheat fields further along the valley still did. You saw a small piece of that equality already without perhaps noticing it as such. Sarah, at 12 years old, worked the lower branches with a precision her younger brother could not yet match, and nobody in that orchard treated her judgment as somehow lesser for belonging to a girl rather than a boy. If anything, Thomas trusted her eye for ripeness nearly as much as he trusted his own, and said so plainly whenever she got it right, which was often. An orchard, unlike a field of standing wheat, simply did not care whose hand reached for the branch, only whether that hand knew what it was doing. Age sorted the work here more than gender ever did if we are being precise about it. A very young child, too small yet to trust with a full basket or a careful twist of the wrist, might instead be handed the simpler job of carrying empty baskets back and forth, or running messages between one end of the orchard and the other, small errands that kept eager little hands usefully occupied without risking a week's worth of careful picking. By the time a child reached Sarah's age, though, that distinction largely disappeared. What mattered from that point forward was skill, patience, and a good eye, none of which cared in the slightest which parent had raised you. Here is a comparison I find quietly telling. After the wheat harvest ended each year, a very particular custom followed one reserved almost entirely for women and children. Gleaning it was called the right to walk back across the stripped fields afterward and gather whatever grain the reapers had missed or dropped, stalk by stalk, ear by ear. It sounds modest, and it was but for a poorer family a few extra baskets of gleaned grain mattered enormously come winter, and the custom was defended fiercely wherever landlords tried to take it away. The orchard had something similar in spirit, though it worked a little differently. Once a family's own picking was finished, windful apples, the ones that had already dropped and lay scattered across the grass, were often left for whoever needed them, neighbours, without an orchard of their own children from a poorer household down the lane, anyone willing to bend down and gather what the trees had simply let go of on their own. More than once that same week, a widow from further down the lane had appeared quietly near the hedge. With her own basket said little beyond a brief exchange of good mornings, and filled it steadily with windfalls. Nobody in Thomas's family had any use for anyway. Nobody made a formal arrangement of it. It was closer to an unspoken understanding, quiet generosity dressed up as nobody's particular business, the kind of small kindness rarely written down anywhere, precisely because everyone involved considered it too ordinary to mention. I rather love that about it, honestly, the fact that this particular kindness left no paper trail whatsoever, no ledger entry, no formal charity recorded in any parish book. It survived purely because enough ordinary people kept quietly doing it year after year, expecting nothing in return beyond the same courtesy, eventually being extended back to them whenever their own turn for hardship happened to arrive. A community, in other words, was not only built from church attendance and quarter-day rent payments. It was built from 100 small unrecorded gestures exactly like this one. Which brings me to something we only touched lightly on before, and it deserves a proper explanation now because it is where most of the actual technique in an apple harvest lived. Not every apple in that orchard was picked the same way, and the difference had nothing to do with laziness or shortcuts. A dessert apple, the kind meant for eating fresh or storing carefully through the winter months, had to come off the tree gently cupped in the palm, twisted rather than pulled, set into the basket rather than dropped. Bruise that apple even slightly and you'd started a clock you could not stop. The flesh beneath the skin begins breaking down almost immediately, once damaged, quietly rotting from the inside, while the outside still looks perfectly presentable, right up until the moment it very much does not. A cider apple faced no such delicate treatment, and honestly did not need it. Once the fruit was clearly ripe, orchard workers in counties across the west of England would often simply knock it down, swinging a long pole up into the higher branches until the whole tree seemed to shudder, apples raining onto the grass below in a rapid, satisfying series of soft thuds one after another, sometimes a dozen at once. Ned adored this particular job more than almost any other task in the orchard for reasons that required no explanation whatsoever to anyone who has ever been 8 years old and handed permission to hit something repeatedly with a stick. Or in some seasons, workers skipped the pole entirely and simply let the ripest fruit fall on its own, gathering the windfalls straight off the ground days later. Bruising did not matter here in the slightest. Within days, every one of those apples was destined for the mill and the press anyway, crushed to pulp regardless of how gently or roughly it had arrived there. Why spend a farmhand's careful, unhurried hour picking by hand what a good hard shake could bring down in a single afternoon? Here is a small, satisfying piece of trivia worth carrying with you tonight, if you enjoy discovering where familiar sayings actually come from. That old expression you've almost certainly heard, "one bad apple spoils the barrel," is not simply a colourful metaphor invented for the sake of a tidy lesson. It describes quite literally what happened inside an apple loft or storage barrel, exactly like the ones this family relied on. A single bruised or damaged dessert apple, packed in among dozens of healthy ones, releases gases and moisture as it breaks down that actively encourage decay in whatever sits beside it. One careless piece of fruit handled roughly during picking really could ruin an entire barrel's worth of careful winter storage by spring. The proverb is not exaggeration. It is a lesson written directly out of a mistake this family could not afford to make twice, which perhaps says something about how many of our tidiest little sayings started out as somebody's very expensive error. Eleanor knew this better than anyone in the household, if we're being completely honest about it. She was the one who inspected the storage baskets each evening, turning apples over one by one in the fading light, setting aside anything with the faintest soft spot or bruise before it could quietly betray the rest. More than once she caught Ned trying to slip a slightly battered apple in near the bottom of the basket, hoping it might go unnoticed until spring. It never did. She would simply hold it up without a word, wait for him to notice the bruise himself and toss it toward the pig trough. Instead, a small wordless lesson repeated often enough that even Ned eventually stopped trying. Thomas managed the trees, the grafting, the broader rhythm of the orchard. Eleanor managed what happened to the fruit after it left the branch, and in a household like theirs, that second job mattered every bit as much as the first, even though history left to its own habits would have quietly forgotten to mention her role at all. That, I think, is worth sitting with honestly for a moment. Most of what we know about this century comes from written records, account books, wage ledgers, formal contracts, and unpaid family labour almost never appears in any of them. A hired hand's wages get written down because money changed hands and someone needed to track it. A wife's daily expertise sorting a season's harvest apple, by careful apple leaves no such paper trail, not because it mattered less, but because nobody at the time thought to record what everybody already understood. It is not so different if you think about it honestly from a pattern plenty of us recognize even now. The work that shows up on a payslip gets counted, discussed, sometimes even celebrated. The work that simply keeps a household functioning day to day, unpaid, unglamorous, endlessly necessary, tends to vanish from the record the moment nobody bothers writing it down. Eleanor was never going to appear in a steward's ledger the way a hired reaper would. That never once meant her contribution weighed less on the actual scale of what kept this family fed through winter. Do you know honestly what the women in your own family history actually did with their days generations back? Or has most of that work quietly gone, the same way Eleanor's has remembered only in the shape of a habit or a recipe passed down, never in any official record at all? I would be curious to hear if that question stays with you tonight. By early afternoon, the baskets stacked near the gate had grown considerably heavier than they had been at sunrise, sorted now into their separate futures. Dessert apples resting carefully on straw cider apples, piled without much ceremony, at all bruises and all waiting for the one part of this whole process none of us have actually watched happen yet. Because picking an apple, as it turns out, was really only ever the opening act. Somewhere beyond the hedge past the little stone shed nobody in this family particularly enjoyed cleaning out. Each September stood the actual machinery of the season quiet for now, waiting its turn. And what happened inside that shed over the coming days would turn every single one of those bruised, unglamorous cider apples into something entirely different, something worth the whole valley's attention. That stone shed, as it turns out, was not simply storage. It was where the entire second half of this harvest actually happened, and if picking apples was the quiet, patient half of the story, what waited inside that door was considerably louder. At the centre of the floor sat a wide, shallow, circular trough, carved directly from solid stone, deep enough to hold a man's leg to the knee, running in a complete ring around a raised stone platform at its middle. Growers in this part of the country call that outer ring the chase, and the platform at its centre the pier. A second stone upright this time, roughly the size of a small cartwheel, and weighing close to a ton, stood balanced on its edge, inside that circular groove ready to be drawn slowly around and around by a horse harnessed to a long wooden arm. This particular mill did not belong to Thomas alone, and it is worth saying so plainly before we go any further. It sat on slightly higher ground at a neighbour's farm, 3 fields over a family with just enough extra land and capital to justify building and maintaining a stone this heavy and a horse strong enough to turn it. 3 other households besides Thomas's took their turn at that same trough, across the span of a single week each autumn, an informal schedule worked out well in advance, one family's baskets arriving as another's cheese came off the press. Thomas tipped the first basket of cider apples onto the stone pier, and with a low word to the horse, the whole mechanism groaned into motion. The great upright wheel began its slow circuit, crushing everything in its path against the trough floor, and as it turned, Thomas fed in more apples a little at a time, letting the stone do the patient work of reducing whole fruit into a thick, fragrant pulp the colour of weak honey. A mill like this one was not the only design in use across the country, either worth mentioning briefly. Travel further west into Devon, and you were just as likely to find a mill built around a pair of fluted wooden rollers instead of a single upright stone, the fruit fed between them and crushed by rotation rather than by weight. Different valley, different solution to precisely the same problem, each community more or less certain their own particular method produced the finest result. An argument I suspect farmers were still quietly having with their neighbours long after the harvest ended and the cider itself had been safely put away. This pulp had its own name, one you may never have heard before tonight. Pomace. Some counties called it pomage instead, a small linguistic difference that tended to shift depending on which valley you happened to be standing in. Whatever the local word, the substance itself smelled extraordinary, sharp and sweet at once, somewhere between fresh apple and something already faintly promisingly alcoholic, even at this early stage hours before any actual fermentation had begun. Can I ask you something rather simple while that horse continues its slow circuit around the stone? Have you ever stood near something being made, really made from raw material to finished product, and caught yourself surprised by how much sound and smell the whole process actually involves? We buy so much today already finished, already sealed and labelled, that I think we quietly forget how sensory an ordinary Tuesday afternoon once was for almost everyone alive. Once enough pomace had accumulated in the trough, the milling stopped, and the second half of the operation began, the part that gave this whole process its rather peculiar name. Rarely did a single cheese contain just one variety of apple, and there is something quietly satisfying in that, considering everything we already know about how differently each variety actually behaved. A skilled cider maker built each cheese from a deliberate blend, sharp bitter sharps balanced against sweeter bitter sweets. One variety's thin body propped up by another's richer tannin, the way a cook might balance salt against sugar rather than relying on either alone. All those separate identities we spent time getting to know earlier in this story, each one so particular about its own name and purpose, were about to be crushed together into a single shared juice, individuality, quite literally dissolving into something new and better than any one tree could have produced entirely on its own. Workers scooped the wet pulp out in thick layers, spreading each one across a square of coarse woven straw, laid flat on a low wooden platform, folding the straw's edges back over the pomace like wrapping a parcel, then setting a second straw-wrapped layer directly on top, and a third above that, and so on, building upward layer after layer after layer. This whole tower of stacked straw-wrapped pulp was called for reasons that become obvious the moment you actually see one a cheese. It closely resembled a great wheel of farmhouse cheese from a distance, banded and layered, standing patiently on the press bed waiting for its moment. That moment arrived by way of a heavy wooden screw thick as a man's thigh threaded through a solid oak frame directly above the stacked cheese. Turned by hand sometimes with the help of a long wooden lever for extra force, the screw descended slowly, pressing down onto the top of the stack with steadily increasing weight. Juice began working its way out almost immediately, trickling first, then running in a proper stream escaping through the straw, and down carved grooves cut into the stone press bed below, finally pooling into a waiting vessel positioned to catch every last drop. Not every press in the country looked quite like this one, and the older design is worth a brief mention if only because it shows how far back this whole craft actually reaches. Before the screw press became common, poorer households sometimes relied on something considerably more ancient. A single massive horizontal beam, one end fixed or pivoted against a wall. The free end resting directly over the cheese, weighted down, not by any turning mechanism at all, but by heavy stones hung or stacked at the beam's far end, slowly dragging that free end downward, under nothing more sophisticated than gravity and patience. Cruder certainly, slower without question. But it worked on precisely the same principle as its more refined cousin, and in some remote corners of the country it kept working for generations after wealthier farms had long since upgraded to a proper screw. I want you to notice the sound of that moment specifically because I think it deserves noticing. Not the crash of machinery, nothing sudden or dramatic. Just a slow, steady creak of oak straining under pressure, a soft, continuous trickle of liquid finding its way downward and somewhere underneath it. All the horse outside still occasionally shifting its weight, waiting for the next basket. It is, if you let yourself imagine it properly, one of the most patient sounds an entire century of hard agricultural labour ever produced, and even once every last drop had been coaxed out of it, nothing about this process ended up wasted. What remained after pressing the dry spent pulp left flattened inside its straw wrapping still held enough goodness in it to be worth keeping. Farmers commonly fed that leftover pomace straight to their pigs and cattle, through the coming winter months, a final unglamorous use for fruit that had already given up its juice, its seeds, and very nearly everything else it had to offer. There was in a household like this one no such thing as an apple that simply went to waste. Even its last driest remnant still had one more job left to do. Not every household owned a press outright, and this is worth saying plainly because it says something honest about how rural communities actually functioned. A press, and especially a full stone mill like this one, represented real capital more than most modest tenant farms could justify building purely for their own harvest. Thomas paid his neighbour a modest portion of the press juice itself for the privilege a jug or two skimmed off the top of each cask, an arrangement neither family had ever bothered writing down, because both understood the terms perfectly well without paper. Cooperation, in other words, was baked directly into the machinery itself, whether anyone involved thought of it in those particular terms or not. A single family working entirely alone could plant an orchard, tend it for years, and still find the final crucial step of turning fruit into cider, quietly out of reach, without a neighbour's goodwill, and a shared afternoon at somebody else's mill. Which brings me back to that grand house I mentioned earlier, the one whose cellars could hold thousands of gallons at once. There is another detail about that same estate worth knowing, one I find even more interesting than the sheer volume of what it stored. Records from the property describe an apple mill acquired for the household in the year 1720, very likely powered by water rather than horse-housed, inside a mill building already a century old by that point. The same document describes the process almost exactly as we have just walked through it. Together fruit ground to pomace, layered this time between mats of reed rather than straw, then pressed and left to ferment quietly in large wooden casks for 6 months, or considerably longer before anyone considered it ready to drink. That same mill turns up again decades later, listed carefully in an inventory, taken after the estate's owner died in 1750, still standing, still working, quietly outliving the man who had commissioned it in the first place. There is something worth sitting with in that particular detail. I think a piece of machinery patiently outlasting the person who built it, still doing exactly the same job for the next generation, without needing to be asked twice. Somewhere in the gap between that grand water-driven mill and the modest horse-drawn stone, Thomas was leaning against right now sat an entire spectrum of English rural life wealth, measured not simply in land or coin, but quite literally in how much of your own harvest you were able to process without asking anybody else's permission first. A skilled cider maker, and there was real skill involved here, whatever the wooden screw and stone wheel might suggest to the contrary, understood something that a rushed or inexperienced household sometimes learned the hard way. Pressing pomace immediately after milling, while technically possible, tended to yield noticeably less juice and a thinner, less flavourful result than pomace, given time to rest, first an hour or more, sometimes overnight, allowing the crushed cells to break down further and release what they were holding more generously once the screw finally came down. Thomas's neighbour, the one who owned this very mill, still told a story about his own first proper harvest as a young man when impatience got the better of him, and he pressed every cheese the moment it was built, eager to see results before dark. He ended that season with noticeably thinner casks than his father had ever produced, and a fairly firm lesson about the difference between finishing quickly and finishing well. Patience yet again turns out to be the quiet thread running through nearly every stage of this entire harvest, from the seed that would not grow true to the graft that took 6 years to fruit to the pulp that simply performed better once nobody rushed it. Sarah, carrying baskets back and forth between the orchard and the mill shed that afternoon, found herself more fascinated by the process than she expected to be, watching juice collect steadily beneath the press, while Ned predictably tried to sneak a taste straight from the stream before anyone could stop him. He came up sputtering, face-twisted into a look of profound betrayal, and announced to nobody in particular that it tasted nothing like the cider their father let him sip at Christmas. Thomas, without even glancing up from the screw, informed him that this was rather the point, and that Patience would eventually turn this exact sourness into something considerably worth the wait, assuming Ned could manage to leave the cask alone in the meantime. Fresh-pressed juice, still hours away from anything resembling finished cider, has a bracing, almost startling sharpness to it, nothing at all like the smooth, settled drink it would eventually become. Do you have anything in your own life you can only fully appreciate once you have seen the entire process behind it start to finish? A meal, a piece of furniture, a garment someone actually stitched by hand. I suspect once you have watched raw material become something finished, you never quite look at the finished version the same way again. By the time the light outside had shifted properly toward afternoon, the first cask sat quietly filling near the wall, cloudy and pale gold, not yet cider. In any meaningful sense, simply juice sweet and unstable, and entirely unaware of everything it was about to become over the coming months in the dark. It is easy watching a scene like that to think of what happens next as a formality, months of quiet waiting before something pleasant eventually gets poured into a cup. But that would badly undersell what this particular liquid actually meant to a household like Thomas and Eleanor's, and to millions of households very much like theirs scattered across this entire century on both sides of an ocean. What sat fermenting in that cask was not simply a treat reserved for special occasions. In more ways than most of us would guess, sitting comfortably in a different century entirely, it was closer to something this family could not have survived the coming year without. Eleanor paused by the cask for a moment before heading back toward the house, resting one hand briefly against its cool wooden side, the way you might check on a sleeping child without quite meaning to wake them. Whatever sat inside, cloudy and unfinished, would spend the coming months doing its own quiet work entirely out of sight. No basket, no ladder, no careful hand, required simply time, darkness, and a patience the whole family had already practiced plenty of that very morning. Survive is not a word I use carelessly, so let me actually justify it, because the numbers behind this particular claim tend to catch people off guard. A typical farm labourer in this century across much of southern and western England received a daily cider allowance as part of his ordinary pay, separate entirely from whatever coin changed hands. 3 to 4 pints a day was fairly standard outside the busiest weeks of the year. During haymaking and harvest itself, when the body burned through far more than any ordinary working day, demanded that allowance often climbed as high as 8 pints, handed out steadily from flagons left waiting at either end of the field. Farmers apparently had their own private shorthand for judging a good worker too, one that sounds almost like a joke until you realise how seriously it was meant. A 2-gallon-a-day man, as the saying went, was worth every extra drop he drank because the work he produced in exchange more than covered it. In the western counties especially, cider could make up as much as 1/5 of a labourer's entire wage, not a bonus, not a treat, but an actual counted portion of what he was owed for a week's honest work. Picture that flagon sitting at the field's edge for a moment, sweating slightly in the sun, half emptied by mid-morning. Nobody drinking from it that day would have called themselves lucky or spoiled. This was simply how the arithmetic of a day's labour worked out. Sweat traded for coin on one hand, sweat traded for cider on the other, both equally expected, both equally necessary to keep a body moving through 8 or 10 hours of properly brutal physical work. A farmhand who somehow found himself without his allowance partway through a long afternoon would have felt the absence the same way you or I might notice a missing paycheck, not devastating on its own, but wrong, unsettling, worth mentioning to whoever was in charge. I want you to sit with that figure for a moment because it tends to reshape how you picture an ordinary harvest field. This was not incidental drinking, the sort of thing a modern employer might quietly frown upon. This was closer to a second currency brewed at home, paid out by the pint and taken every bit as seriously as the coins in a farmer's pocket. Take that currency away entirely, and you are not simply removing a comfort. You were cutting a labourer's actual income by a meaningful fraction, and asking his body to keep performing exactly the same demanding hours regardless. Here is the obvious question, and I suspect you are already halfway to asking it yourself. Why cider specifically, and why in such staggering quantity? Part of the answer sits in simple reliability. Clean water was not always something a rural household could take for granted, particularly once you moved into any settlement larger than a scattered handful of farms and beer or cider. Both properly fermented carried a built-in safety that plain water from a shared well or stream could not always promise. This was never a universal rule stretching across every parish equally worth being honest about, since a farm with its own clean spring had little reason to worry either way. But in enough places, often enough fermented drink simply proved the safer daily habit, and habits formed under real necessity tend to outlast the necessity itself by several generations. Part of the answer, too, was simply arithmetic. Worcestershire alone, by the close of this century, was shipping something in the neighbourhood of 1,100,000 gallons of cider outward every single year, an almost unimaginable volume for what most of us today would file away as a seasonal treat rather than a genuine engine of the rural economy. Set that figure beside anything grown for direct sale as food, and cider starts to look less like a beverage and considerably more like a proper agricultural export shipped by the wagon load to towns and cities that had no orchards of their own to rely on. A county's entire reputation in some cases rode on the reliability of its cider harvest every bit as much as it did on wheat or wool. Now let's cross that same ocean again, because this particular story looks even more dramatic once you follow it to the American colonies. The earliest English settlers arriving on that unfamiliar coastline found apple trees already growing wild, but only the small, sharp, largely inedible crabapple, nothing resembling the fruit they had left behind. Within a remarkably short time, requests for proper apple seed and grafted stock were travelling back across the Atlantic, and colonial orchards began taking root almost as quickly as the settlements themselves. Barley, as it turned out, proved considerably harder to grow reliably in this new soil and climate than apples did, which meant beer. The familiar English staple struggled to establish itself the way cider effortlessly did instead. Cider became quite rapidly the default drink on the early American table morning, noon and evening, consumed by nearly everyone in the household regardless of age. It is a small, quietly funny irony worth pausing on that the drink so many of us now think of as distinctly English actually became within a couple of generations arguably more central to daily colonial American life than it ever was back in the country that taught them how to make it. Even children were included, though sensibly given a gentler version. Households would take the already spent pomace, the very same dry-pressed pulp we discussed sitting in its straw, wrapping only a little while ago, and soak it again in fresh water, coaxing out one final much weaker round of juice sometimes called ciderkin or water cider. Barely alcoholic at all by the time it reached a child's cup, it still carried enough of the apple's character to feel like a genuine drink, rather than plain water dressed up to look interesting. There is something rather touching in that particular bit of thrift. Honestly, an entire family working its way down through every last useful drop a single harvest could offer. First the proper cider for the adults, then this second, gentler pressing for the youngest mouths in the house. Nothing wasted, nobody left out, right down to the very last child at the table. An entire household, top to bottom, oldest to youngest, built its daily hydration around the very same fruit we've spent this whole evening walking through orchard to press to table. Can I ask you something while we sit with that picture for a moment? Do you have a drink in your own life today that quietly plays a similar role, less a luxury, more an unquestioned daily habit woven so deeply into your routine you would honestly struggle to name the last morning you went without it? I suspect more of us share something with Thomas's household on this particular point than we might first assume. Now, I promised you earlier that this story carried a shadow alongside its comfort, and this is where that shadow properly belongs, because it is a truly important piece of the picture not a footnote tacked on for drama's sake. Down in Devon, not so very far from where our own family lived and worked, generations of cider drinkers had quietly suffered from a mysterious, often agonizing illness, one locals simply called the Devonshire colic. Sufferers doubled over with severe abdominal pain, sometimes vomiting, occasionally growing seriously ill for weeks at a stretch, in the worst cases never fully recovering at all. The very first written account of it dates back to the middle of the previous century, and for well over 100 years afterward, nobody could satisfactorily explain why. Most assumed it was simply the natural sharpness of the drink itself, its acidity disagreeing with the sensitive constitution, an unfortunate but unavoidable cost of loving cider quite this much. A physician even offered an early scientific description of the affliction decades before anyone actually solved it, noting the symptoms carefully, without ever identifying the true culprit hiding in plain sight the entire time. The mystery had even worked its way into popular verse by the early years of this century, a well-known poem devoted entirely to the subject of cider making, pausing at one point to describe quite vividly the misery that could follow an unwholesome batch, though naturally like everyone else at the time without the faintest idea what was actually causing it. It says something about how deeply this particular anxiety had settled into ordinary life, when even poets writing in praise of cider felt compelled to warn their readers about it. It took a physician named George Baker working carefully through the 1760s to finally uncover the actual cause, and the answer had nothing to do with apples at all. Over the course of roughly 5 years, Baker examined some 300 serious cases in local hospitals, patiently ruling out one explanation after another, refusing to settle for the comfortable old excuse of simple acidity that everyone before him had accepted without question. Baker, after treating hundreds of serious cases and comparing notes with contacts abroad, including rather wonderfully a conversation with Benjamin Franklin, who recognized the symptoms as strikingly similar to lead poisoning, he had observed among printers back home, began investigating the actual equipment Devon's cider makers were using. What he found was quietly damning. Unlike the wooden presses common in neighbouring cider counties, the very same design our own family relied on this morning, many Devon presses were lined with sheets of lead and cleaned afterward using lead shot rolled around inside them. Acidic apple juice sitting against that metal for hours at a time was steadily leaching poison directly into the very drink an entire county depended on for daily survival. Baker published his findings in 1767, and the reaction from Devon's own cider trade was not exactly gracious. A number of local producers still recovering from a punishing cider tax, only recently repealed, pushed back hard against his conclusions, worried the whole affair would frighten customers away from their livelihood entirely. But the evidence held. Once Baker's findings were finally accepted and lead was gradually removed from the equipment, the Devonshire colic simply began to disappear. Even decades later, well into the new century, writers touring the region were still recording lingering suspicion around cider drinking, generally a wariness that lingered in local memory long after the actual danger had been removed from the presses themselves. By the early decades of the following century, doctors in the region reported it had become almost impossible to find a fresh case at all. I find something quite sobering in that story, if I'm honest with you, and I think it is worth sitting with rather than rushing past. The very same substance an entire rural economy leaned on for wages, hydration and daily survival could, depending entirely on the equipment it happened to pass through, become something quietly working against the people who trusted it most. Not because the apples themselves had changed, because of something invisible sitting in the machinery that nobody thought to question for well over 100 years, Have you ever trusted a routine, a product, or a daily habit completely right up until the moment you learned something troubling about how it was actually made? I think that particular kind of quiet betrayal, discovering the danger was never in the thing itself but in something attached to it, feels oddly familiar. Even now, centuries and an ocean away from Devon cider presses, we still do this, constantly trusting the container far more than we ever bother questioning it, right up until somebody finally asks the one obvious question nobody thought to ask for 100 years. Back in our own family's orchard, none of this danger applied, worth saying plainly, so you're not left with the wrong impression. Their press, like most across this part of the country, was built entirely from oak and stone, no lead anywhere near the juice. Eleanor had no reason to suspect the cask, now quietly settling in the corner of the shed, of anything beyond simply being cider patient and unremarkable, exactly as it had always been in her family. Come winter, that same cask would sit near the kitchen hearth, drawn from daily, the way a modern household might reach for a kettle poured for Thomas, after a cold morning in the fields watered down slightly for Sarah and Ned, the way most households handled cider for younger children, and occasionally offered to a passing neighbour as easily and unthinkingly as we might offer someone a cup of tea today. Still, I think there is something worth carrying forward from Devon's particular misfortune regardless, a reminder that the things we trust most completely are sometimes precisely the things we've stopped bothering to examine closely at all. There is one more piece of this household's relationship with the land we've not yet properly discussed, and it has very little to do with what grows on the trees or ferments in the cask. It has to do with who exactly was legally allowed to call any of this their own in the first place. Every basket, every cask, every carefully grafted tree we have followed so far in this story existed on ground that Thomas himself did not fully own, and Eleanor married into that same uncertain arrangement, occupied a position within it. More complicated, still one worth understanding properly before this particular harvest day draws any closer to its end. Here is where this story takes a turn most people never expect, because the answer to that question involves rather less romance than an orchard, usually inspires, and rather more paperwork. Stick with me regardless, because I think this particular thread matters more than almost anything else we've touched on so far tonight. Under English law in this century, a married woman simply did not exist as a separate legal person, not in any practical sense a court would recognize. The law had a name for her condition, coverture, and a woman living under it was called quite literally a covered woman. Her entire legal identity folded into her husband's the moment she said her vows. She could not sign a contract in her own name. She could not sue or be sued independently. Any money she earned, any property she brought into the marriage, any object she might otherwise have called entirely her own, belonged under the law to her husband automatically and without exception, the instant it came into her possession. A well-known legal scholar working on his own great study of English law during these very same decades would eventually put the principle into words that later generations quoted endlessly, describing a wife's legal existence as effectively suspended for the length of the marriage, absorbed entirely into her husband's. He did not invent the idea. He simply wrote down more clearly than anyone before him an arrangement that households like Thomas and Eleanor's had already been quietly living inside for generations, long before anyone thought to explain it on paper in such tidy, deliberate language. There is something almost strange when you think about it properly in realizing that the very decades this family spent tending an ordinary orchard were also the exact decades a formal legal explanation of Eleanor's status was being carefully composed in a study somewhere else entirely by a man who likely never once thought about apples while he wrote it. History rarely announces itself as history while it is actually happening. It simply looks from the inside like an ordinary Tuesday, an ordinary harvest, an ordinary marriage, quietly following rules nobody in that orchard had personally chosen, and few had ever seen written down in full. Which means quite plainly that everything we have spent this evening watching Eleanor do sorting apples with an expert, no one else in the household could match, catching bruised fruit before it could spoil a whole basket, managing an entire season's worth of careful judgment. None of it made her the legal owner of a single apple. Not one. In the eyes of any court in the land, every basket, every cask, every coin that cider might eventually earn belonged to Thomas alone, whether or not his hand had actually touched it. I want to sit with that for a moment, honestly, because I think it deserves more than a passing mention. Here was a woman whose knowledge kept an entire household's winter provisions from spoiling, whose judgment Thomas trusted as much as his own, and the law of her own country would have described her on paper as having no independent claim to any of it whatsoever. Picture for a moment what this actually meant in practice, rather than simply as an abstract point of law. If Eleanor had wanted to walk into Norwich Market herself and sell a barrel of her own cider, negotiate her own price sign, her own receipt, she legally could not have done any of it without her husband's name standing somewhere behind the transaction, whether he was physically present or not. Her own skill, her own judgment, her own hours spent inspecting every apple by lamplight, all of it flowed automatically into an account that was never strictly speaking hers to draw from independently. She could run the household's entire economy in practice, while owning almost none of it on paper. Can I ask you something while we sit with that particular unfairness for a moment? Have you ever done work that mattered enormously to the outcome, only to have someone else's name attached to the credit, the paycheck, or the ownership? I suspect that particular frustration in some form or another is not nearly as unfamiliar to modern life as we might like to believe even now, with laws that look considerably fairer on paper than the ones Eleanor lived under. Now there was one narrow, rather morbid exception carved into this whole arrangement, and it is worth understanding properly because it changes the entire picture. The moment a husband died, English common law granted his widow something called dower, a guaranteed right to 1/3 of his land and property for the remainder of her own life. Nobody could simply write her out of it in a will. No creditor could seize it out from under her without her own consent. It was on paper at least remarkably generous, generous enough that plenty of husbands actually went out of their way to avoid it, entirely arranging a smaller fixed income for their wife, instead through a separate written agreement known as a jointure, precisely because the full legal entitlement of dower was considered rather too costly to the rest of the family's inheritance. A husband who wanted his eldest son to receive the entire estate intact, unencumbered by a widow's lifelong third, had every practical incentive to negotiate her down to something smaller while he still had the legal standing to do so. The very right meant to protect a widow, in other words, was frequently the very thing her own husband spent years quietly working around. Sit with the strange shape of the arrangement for a moment. A woman gained more legal standing over her own household, more independent claimed the very land she may have spent decades working at the exact moment she lost her husband than she had held at any single point during the entire marriage that preceded it. Widowhood of all things was often the closest a woman in this century came to genuine legal personhood. Do you remember the widow we mentioned earlier this evening, the one who quietly gathered windfall apples near the hedge, while Thomas's family finished their own picking? I want you to picture her a little differently now with this particular piece of law sitting behind her. She'd inherited a small orchard of her own from her late husband some years back, hardly grand, a handful of aging trees, and a patch of ground barely worth mentioning beside an estate like Hestercombe. And yet, in the strict eyes of the law, every single one of those trees was entirely hers to manage, sell, or give away exactly as she chose without asking a single soul's permission first. She kept her own accounts. She negotiated her own price when a buyer came asking. Nobody's name stood behind hers on any document she signed. Poorer than Eleanor almost certainly, and yet in the one narrow category that actually mattered to a court of law considerably freer. There is something worth turning over honestly in that particular contrast, I think. Eleanor married secure, provided for, could not legally claim a single apple from the orchard she managed every single day. The widow, poor, uncertain, gathering fruit nobody else wanted, could at least stand in front of a magistrate and be heard as herself, rather than as an extension of a husband no longer living. Security and legal personhood, it turns out, did not always arrive in the same household at the same time. Sarah, 12 years old and already showing the same sharp eye for a ripe apple her mother possessed, would grow into this same arrangement one day, whether anyone in that orchard chose to explain it to her plainly or not. Marry well, and she would gain a household, a measure of comfort, perhaps even genuine happiness, alongside a legal identity quietly absorbed into someone else's. Remain unmarried, or eventually outlive a husband of her own, and she would gain something closer to independence, though very likely with considerably less security wrapped around it. There was no version of this particular arrangement worth being honest about that offered a woman in this century both freedom and safety in equal measure at the very same time. Nobody explained any of this to Sarah directly that particular afternoon, of course. She was busy stacking empty baskets, entirely unaware that the very ground she stood on, and the entire legal architecture surrounding the orchard, she already understood better than most adults twice her age, would one day sort her life along exactly these same narrow lines. Childhood at least granted her a few more years before any of it applied to her personally. Eleanor, watching her daughter work, may well have thought about this a little more than she ever let herself say out loud. None of this worth saying clearly means the orchard held no real economic weight for a family like Thomas and Eleanor's, whatever the law happened to say about who technically owned it on paper. Quite the opposite, in fact. Consider a Norfolk farmer, a real one whose account books from the final years of this century still survive. In one particular autumn, he kept 15 sacks of apples back for his own household's use and carried the remaining 28 sacks to market in Norwich, where he sold them for £8 and 2 shillings. Set that figure beside what the very same farmer earned that same season from fattening and selling a bullock, months of feed care and patience invested in a single animal, and the two numbers land astonishingly close together. Think about what that comparison actually means for a moment, because I think it is easy to let a figure like that slide past without properly absorbing it. Raising a bullock to market weight meant an entire season of grazing land set aside, feed purchased or grown, daily attention paid to a single living creature that could sick and injure itself, or simply fail to fatten properly despite every precaution taken. An orchard once established required nothing close to that level of ongoing risk or daily tending, and yet here it was delivering comparable returns, almost as an afterthought tucked in around the edges of a farm's real, more celebrated business. An orchard properly managed could rival livestock as a source of real household income, and it demanded nothing close to the same daily labour a bullock required. There was an odd little bureaucratic footnote attached to all of this too, one I find quietly amusing precisely because of how specific it is. When a household's produce was assessed for tithe, the traditional payment owed to the local church orchard fruit was valued officially at exactly the same rate as a beehive taxed at a single penny a year, regardless of how many baskets the trees had actually produced that season. A modest garden orchard and a thriving commercial one by this particular accounting cost their owners identically little, a single penny, changing hands whether the harvest filled 3 baskets or 300. Whoever originally decided that a hive of bees and an entire orchard's harvest belonged in the same tidy little tax category never explained their reasoning to anyone who wrote it down, and I rather love that this small, strange bit of equivalence survived on paper for so long without anybody apparently questioning it. There is something almost comforting in discovering that even a deeply serious legal and religious system occasionally ran on decisions this arbitrary decided once, by somebody long forgotten, and simply repeated out of habit for generations afterward. So here is where I think the real quiet truth of this whole arrangement actually lives. The orchard's money formerly belonged to Thomas. Its yield was recorded, if it was recorded at all, in his name, filtered through his authority, protected under his legal identity rather than hers, and yet Eleanor's expertise was the actual mechanism keeping that value intact season after season, basket after basket. Law is very good at declaring who owns something on paper. It has always been considerably worse at accurately describing who actually keeps that something valuable in practice. An orchard in that particular sense was not just fruit trees and property lines. It was a small everyday demonstration of exactly how far real influence could travel underneath a legal structure never designed to notice it was there at all. I do not say any of this to leave you with a heavy feeling before we move on, though. I understand if it lingers a little. I say it because I think Eleanor deserves to be understood accurately, not simply as a supporting figure standing quietly beside her husband in this story, but as someone whose actual competence carried far more weight in that household than the law of her own century was ever willing to admit on paper. By the time the afternoon had properly settled into itself, baskets stacked, cider casks resting, the family's attention was already beginning to drift toward everything else autumn still demanded of them. Because apples as generous as this particular harvest had been, were never the only thing racing against the calendar this time of year, and the clock on all of it was ticking rather more urgently than anyone standing in that orchard this morning had fully let themselves admit. Frost does not send a warning letter ahead of itself, and I think that particular fact deserves saying plainly, because it shaped almost every decision this family made from this point in the season onward. There was no forecast to consult, no gentle notification a day or two in advance. One morning the grass simply crunched underfoot in a way it had not the day before, and by then whatever preparations remained unfinished were already running dangerously late. Everything we have walked through so far this evening, the picking, the grafting, the pressing, the law, quietly sitting underneath all of it existed inside a much larger, considerably less forgiving deadline. Somewhere out past the hedgerows, the first proper killing, frost was already gathering itself together, and nobody in this household could tell you the precise morning it would finally arrive. What they did know with total certainty was that everything still unfinished when it did arrive would very likely be lost. Let's start with the apples themselves, because we left their story slightly unfinished earlier tonight. Getting the dessert apples off the tree without bruising them, which we discussed already, was only the opening move. Keeping them edible clear through to the following spring required its own separate, considerably more patient set of skills. The preferred method, practiced across a great many English households in this century, involved building the fruit into careful layers, apples on one level, a thick bed of perfectly dry straw, immediately above it, then another layer of apples, then straw again, continuing upward inside a hamper, a wooden box, or simply a dry unheated corner of a spare room, set aside specifically for this purpose. The straw served a purpose considerably more important than simple padding. It kept each apple from touching its neighbours, directly slowed the spread of moisture from one fruit to the next, and allowed just enough air to circulate through the whole arrangement to stop the entire stack turning damp and musty over the coming months. The whole arrangement needed checking every so often through the winter, not out of idle curiosity but necessity. Any apple beginning to spot or soften had to be pulled out and used immediately before it could quietly take its neighbours down with it. Some households went further still, wrapping each apple individually in soft paper before packing them away, a slower process, but a considerably more reliable one, sealed tight enough in some cases that a properly wrapped apple could still taste respectable the following spring, months after it left the branch. Its flavour often mellowed and deepened rather than simply preserved, a slow, quiet improvement that surprised nobody who had watched their grandmother do this same thing every autumn of her life. Here is a small comparison I find honestly interesting, if you will forgive one more transatlantic detour before we move on. In England, this careful layering inside a dry room or a specially built apple loft tended to be the dominant approach. Cross the ocean into the American colonies, though, and you find a rather different solution taking hold. Instead, the true underground root cellar dug directly into a hillside or beneath the house itself, lined with stone brick or timber, keeping produce cool through summer and safely above freezing through winter alike. Both regions were solving the exact same problem, keeping food edible without the modern luxury of refrigeration, but the American landscape colder winters and more available land to dig into nudged colonial households toward burying their storage rather than simply setting it aside in a spare upstairs room, the way most of their English cousins did. It is a small, telling reminder that necessity rarely produces just one correct answer. Given the same basic problem, two branches of the same culture separated by an ocean, and only a generation or two quietly arrived at two entirely different solutions, each one perfectly sensible given the ground each family happened to be standing on. Do you have a particular way you store something perishable at home even now? A method passed down from a parent or grandparent seems slightly old-fashioned, yet somehow still works better than anything modern packaging has managed to replace. I would guess more of us carry a small habit like that than we tend to admit out loud. There is something rather grounding, I find, in realizing how much of this careful, patient labor was really just an elaborate exercise in buying time. Nobody in Thomas and Eleanor's household could actually stop winter from arriving, could not negotiate with frost or persuade the days to stay longer than they intended to. All any of this straw paper and careful stacking could really do was slow decay down just enough to stretch one golden generous autumn across 5 or 6 considerably leaner months still waiting ahead. That in the end is really what all of this preparation amounted to, not defeating winter, which nobody in this century seriously imagined possible, but negotiating with it, buying back a few more weeks of comfort through nothing more sophisticated than attention, patience, and a great deal of dry straw. Apples, though generous, were never the only thing this family needed to secure before the weather turned properly hostile, and I think this is where the season starts to feel rather breathless, if you picture it properly, rather than simply as a single harvest, unfolding calmly from start to finish. Midway through this same month on a date the countryside had long ago nicknamed Nutting Day, entire villages would set out together into the woods, and hedgerows, baskets, and hooked sticks in hand, gathering hazelnuts, sometimes called filberts, from branches too high to reach comfortably by hand alone. Those hooked sticks were purpose-built for exactly this task, a simple curved length of wood fashioned specifically to snag a laden branch and draw it down within reach, sparing anyone the trouble of climbing after nuts that always seemed to cluster just beyond an outstretched arm. This was not simply grim necessary labour, either worth saying clearly because it carried a properly festive character all its own. Whole families walked out together for what amounted to a working picnic, food and drink, packed alongside the baskets, children racing ahead through the undergrowth while their parents worked at a steadier pace behind them, and the custom apparently reached high enough up the social ladder that even wealthier households took part for the sheer pleasure of it. Records from one of England's oldest schools describe the boys there receiving an actual holiday on this same day, specifically to go nutting provided they returned afterward with a share of the harvest set aside as a gift for their masters. I rather love that detail, honestly, the idea of an entire English institution built around discipline and Latin grammar, pausing its whole schedule because the hazelnuts were finally ready. Walnuts followed a slightly different calendar entirely and demanded their own separate kind of patience. Pick them too early while the outer green husk still clung stubbornly to the shell, and households would preserve them whole husk, and all suspended in vinegar and spices for months, transforming into the dark, richly flavoured pickled walnuts that would eventually grace a table at Christmas, an entire season of anticipation packed into a single small jar. The husk itself stained hands a deep, stubborn brown that could take days to properly fade a badge nearly every family member wore at some point during this particular week of the year, whether they had actually helped with the gathering or simply happened to touch the wrong doorknob afterward. Wait instead for the husk to properly split and the nut to drop on its own, usually as October wore on, and you had a very different product altogether, the familiar hard-shelled nut most of us would actually recognize today, destined for slow roasting by the fire on the darkest evenings still to come. Firewood, too, could not simply wait its turn politely behind everything else demanding attention. Whatever had been felled and left seasoning through the summer needed splitting, stacking, and moving under cover before the rains this month tended to turned every woodpile into a sodden, half-useless mess. Thomas would spend whatever spare hour he could steal from the orchard swinging an axe against the same battered chopping block his own father had likely used, splitting rounds of wood into lengths that would eventually feed the kitchen hearth through the darkest months ahead. A family that let this particular task slip too far down the list might find itself come the coldest weeks of winter, burning wood too wet to properly catch filling the house with smoke rather than warmth. An uncomfortable lesson few households cared to repeat twice. I want you to notice something about all of this activity happening at once, because I think it is easy to underestimate from a comfortable distance of several centuries. This was not one task calmly following another in tidy sequence. This was apples, nuts, firewood, and a dozen other quieter chores we've not even mentioned tonight. Salting meat, mending fences before livestock needed to be moved for winter, grazing patching, whatever gaps had opened in the thatch over summer, all competing for the same shrinking number of daylight hours in the same handful of weeks, with the exact same unmovable deadline hanging over every single one of them. A family that fell behind on any one thread of this tangled rope did not simply lose that one task. They lost ground on everything else waiting patiently behind it too, because there was no borrowing extra time from November, once October had quietly run out. Eleanor liked to tell a small cautionary story about a family 2 farms over one that had lingered too long over a stubbornly slow apple harvest. One particular autumn, distracted by a sick cow that needed constant attention, and simply never got around to properly laying in their winter stores before the first hard frost arrived early that year. Half their crop left too long in open baskets rather than properly layered and covered, turned soft and unusable within a fortnight, a mistake that meant a considerably leaner winter than the harvest itself had actually promised. It was not laziness that undid them, Eleanor always added at this point in the telling, careful never to make the story sound like simple judgment. It was simply the arithmetic of the season catching up with a family that had, through no real fault of their own, run out of hours before they ran out of tasks. Can I ask you something rather direct while we sit inside that particular pressure for a moment? Have you ever found yourself racing several competing deadlines at once, each one perfectly reasonable on its own, entirely unreasonable stacked together? I suspect that particular flavour of autumn stress has not actually changed nearly as much across the centuries as we might assume, even if the specific tasks certainly have. We trade apple lofts for tax deadlines and firewood for end-of-year reports. But the underlying feeling, that quiet, low-grade hum of too many important things converging on too few remaining days, seems to have survived the intervening centuries almost perfectly intact. Back in Thomas and Eleanor's own household, the afternoon eventually folded itself around exactly this kind of quiet, layered urgency. Sarah and Ned were sent out toward the hedgerow with a basket and one of their father's old hooked sticks, technically hunting hazelnuts. Though Ned's actual success rate leaned rather more heavily toward eating whatever he found before it reached the basket at all. Sarah predictably kept a running tally out loud of exactly how many nuts her brother had personally eaten, versus actually collected a tally Ned strongly disputed on the grounds that the ones he ate still technically counted toward the day's total effort. Eleanor, meanwhile, had already begun the slow, patient work of wrapping the finest dessert apples one by one in soft paper, setting each into a shallow box destined for the coolest, driest corner of the house she could find, her fingers moving through the motion with the unthinking ease of someone who had performed this exact task every single autumn of her adult life. Neither task looked particularly dramatic from the outside. Together, though, they represented the difference between a household that would eat comfortably come February and one that would not. There is one more thread of this particular autumn we've not touched yet, and it belongs less to the practical, sensible side of the season we have spent tonight exploring, and rather more to something older, stranger, and considerably harder to explain with straw paper or careful arithmetic. Because underneath all this sensible preparation, all this straw and paper and careful counting of days, this family also carried a whole separate set of beliefs about the orchard itself, beliefs that had nothing to do with keeping fruit fresh, and everything to do with keeping the trees themselves happy enough to bear fruit again come next autumn. Belief in this century rarely announced itself as belief. It simply moved quietly alongside the sensible, practical work we have spent tonight, following straw and paper on one hand, something considerably older and stranger on the other, both taken seriously by the very same people in the very same breath. Nobody in this household would have described themselves as superstitious exactly. They would simply have called it common sense, the ordinary sensible way a family looked after the thing that fed them. Let's start with the younger members of this household, because this particular thread of folklore belonged especially to them. All Hallows Eve sat only days away from the harvest we have been walking through this evening, close enough on the calendar that the two occasions practically leaned against one another. Baskets were barely stacked cider, barely settling in its cask, before the household's attention would already be turning toward this second, stranger, night one with far less to do with the practical business of survival, and considerably more to do with curiosity, courtship, and a little pleasant fright shared among friends. And on that particular night across England, young unmarried women turned to the very fruit this family had spent all day gathering, hoping it might tell them something no amount of careful basket sorting ever could, namely, who exactly they were destined to marry. The most common version of the game was almost embarrassingly simple, at least on the surface. A girl would peel an apple in one single unbroken ribbon, taking real care not to let the peel snap partway through, then toss the whole coiled strip backward over her left shoulder without looking. Whatever letter that peel happened to form as it landed on the floor behind her, twisted and curled by pure chance, was believed to reveal the first initial of her future husband's name. Other versions ask considerably more of a girl's nerve. Stand before a mirror at midnight, a single candle for light, slowly eating an apple, or combing her hair while she did. And the face of her future husband was said to appear, reflected just over her own shoulder, watching her from somewhere in the glass. There were quieter versions too, less theatrical but just as widely practiced. A girl might simply slip a small piece of apple beneath her pillow before sleeping, trusting that whatever face wandered through her dreams that night belonged to her future husband. Groups of young people gathered together for the evening, sometimes hung apples on strings before a lit fire and set them spinning, watching carefully to see whose apple dropped first, since that person, according to the game, would be the first among the group to marry. I will admit, if I had been asked to stare into a darkened mirror alone at midnight as a girl waiting for a strange man's face to appear behind me, I suspect I would have found something else to do with my evening entirely. But these games were rarely played in genuine dread. They were played at gatherings among friends, half in earnest and half simply for the thrill of a good scare shared together, not unlike the very stories you and I are sharing tonight, honestly. Sarah at 12 was still a year or two away from being invited to try any of this herself, but she had clearly watched older girls in the village attempt it before, because she mentioned the peel trick to her mother that very afternoon, half question, half challenge, wanting to know if it had ever worked on her. Eleanor only laughed and said the peel had spelled out something entirely unreadable. The one time she tried it as a girl, a shape that could have belonged to half the alphabet depending on how generously you squinted at it, and that she had married Thomas anyway, which seemed to settle the matter as far as she was concerned. Sarah, unsatisfied, pressed further, wanting to know if her mother had at least hoped for a particular letter that night. Eleanor only smiled and returned to her basket the kind of answer that told Sarah everything and nothing at exactly the same time. Can I ask you something rather playful while we sit with this for a moment? Did you grow up with any small superstition like this yourself? Something you never quite believed and never quite ignored either, just in case? I think most of us are carrying at least one of these, whether we admit it in daylight or not. Now here is where this particular story has to travel forward in the calendar for a moment months past the harvest. We've spent this whole evening inside because the deepest belief this family held about their orchard did not actually belong to autumn at all. It belonged to the very dead of winter, to a night called 12th night, arriving roughly 12 days after Christmas, when households across the cider counties of England's Somerset, very much included, walked out into their frozen orchards after dark to perform a ceremony that had almost nothing to do with picking fruit and everything to do with keeping the trees themselves content. This was wassailing, and the practice was already old by the time our own family lived through it, mentioned in written records reaching back to the final years of the 1500s, when groups of young men were already known to travel between orchards in Kent performing the ceremony in exchange for a little food, drink or coin from the grateful farmer. By the time Thomas and Eleanor's own generation carried the custom forward, nobody could have told you exactly how old it truly was, only that it had always simply been done every winter without anyone needing to ask why. Villagers sometimes, an entire community, sometimes just a single household, would gather beneath the oldest, most productive tree in the orchard, after dark, carrying cider torches and considerably more noise than the occasion strictly required. In some accounts from this same period, each person carried their own small earthenware cup, filled to the brim with warmed cider and a roasted apple bobbing somewhere inside it, standing together beneath the chosen tree to drink. Toast soaked thoroughly in cider was hung directly in the branches, an offering meant partly for the tree itself, and partly for the robins believed to serve as its guardians. Cider was poured out around the roots as a kind of toast the earth itself could drink. And then deliberately joyfully the whole gathered crowd made as much racket as they possibly could, banging pots, shouting into the dark, sometimes firing a shotgun directly up through the bare branches, all of it aimed at frightening off whatever evil spirits might otherwise be lurking there waiting to spoil next year's crop before it had even begun. In Somerset specifically, not far at all from the very orchard we've spent this evening inside, one village still holds a wassail every single year that reaches back this same distance, in time gathered around trees their own great-grandparents would likely have recognised. In some parishes the evening grew into something closer to a proper community festival than a simple ritual, a young man and woman chosen to lead the whole procession, as a kind of wassail king and queen crowned with whatever greenery the winter hedgerows could still offer, walking at the head of the noisy crowd from one orchard to the next, till every tree-worth blessing had received its share of cider toast and shouting. Underneath all of this noise and cider sat one particular belief worth naming clearly because I think it explains so much of what we've already watched this family do without fully understanding why. Many households in this part of England believed the very oldest tree in an orchard was inhabited by a guardian spirit sometimes simply called the apple tree man, who held the fertility of the entire orchard somewhere inside himself. Please every other tree as you liked. Neglect that one particular ancient trunk and the whole orchard might quietly fail to bear fruit the following year, regardless of how carefully everything else had been tended. Do you remember earlier this evening Eleanor pausing by the oldest tree near the gate, the twisted strange one resting her palm against its rough bark for a moment, before returning to her work, a small habit nobody in the family, not even Thomas, could fully explain? I did not tell you why at the time, because I wanted you to simply notice it happening first, the way Eleanor herself likely never stopped to examine her own reasons too closely either. I suspect quietly, without ever needing to say so out loud, she understood exactly which tree in that orchard deserved a little extra attention, and exactly why. I like to imagine, though, this particular part is honestly my own gentle guess rather than anything a document could prove, that some distant version of this same belief was sitting quietly behind Eleanor's hand every single time she paused there. Not fear exactly. Something closer to courtesy, the kind you might extend to an elderly relative whose stories you've heard 100 times before, offered not because you expect to learn anything new, but because respect, once it becomes habit, rarely bothers asking permission to continue. There is a second, gentler piece of this same belief worth knowing too, one that actually happened during the very harvest we spent tonight following, rather than months later at 12th night. Families who held to this tradition would deliberately leave a handful of apples unpicked on the highest branches when the rest of the harvest came down, not through carelessness, not because the fruit was out of reach, but as a small quiet gift left behind on purpose. Some called this griggling, others called it pixie hoarding. Whatever the local word, the idea beneath it stayed the same, that the orchard itself deserved to keep a small share of its own abundance offered back rather than taken entirely. If you look back on this very morning's picking with that in mind, you might notice Thomas leaving 3 or 4 apples untouched near the very top of the oldest tree, apples Sarah could easily have reached with the ladder had anyone asked her to. Nobody asked her to. Nobody needed to explain why either. I find something rather lovely in that particular custom, if I am honest with you. In a century that measured almost everything by careful arithmetic, sacks, counted casks, measured wages, calculated down to the last penny, this one small gesture asked a family to deliberately leave value behind uncollected simply out of respect for the tree that had given them so much already. Here is the question I keep circling back to, turning this whole evening over in my head. Why would a family this practical, this careful about straw and paper, and the precise arithmetic of survival also believe in the very same breath that a tree might hold a spirit worth honouring. I do not think it is really a contradiction at all the more I sit with it. When your entire winter depends on something as unpredictable as a tree deciding to bear fruit again next year, despite frost blight and every other danger completely outside your control, perhaps a little ritual respect costs nothing and offers something worth having, regardless of whether any spirit is actually listening. Call it superstition if you like. I rather think of it as gratitude dressed up in a shape this century knew how to wear. Do you have a small ritual of your own, something you do before an exam, a flight, a first day somewhere new that you cannot fully justify with logic, but would never quite feel comfortable skipping either? I suspect the impulse behind Eleanor's hand on that old bark and whatever small habit you just thought of are not nearly as different as 3 centuries might suggest. Because for all this careful preparation, all this respectful noise made toward invisible spirits, and all this patient arithmetic laid against straw and frost, the truth underneath this entire story is that an orchard could still fail. Despite every precaution, every offering left in the branches, every superstition faithfully observed, there were years when none of it was enough. Years when the trees simply did not answer back, the way this family and every family like them had quietly hoped they would. Ritual, however sincerely practiced, was never actually a guarantee. It was closer to a conversation this family kept having with something they could not control, hoping without any real proof. Either way, that showing up mattered even when the outcome remained entirely out of their hands. And that particular truth, the honest limits of everything we have discussed tonight, deserves its own telling before this night is through. Let's actually name a few of those failures properly, because I think the honest version of this story matters more than the comfortable one, and this particular family's harvest, generous as it was this year, existed inside a much larger picture that was not always nearly so kind. Every orchard we have admired tonight, every careful graft, every basket filled with patient labour, sat exposed to forces no amount of skill or devotion could fully guard against. Not many years from the very autumn we have spent tonight inside the government in London drowning in debt, after a long and expensive war fought across 3 continents, looked at the cider counties of the West Country and decided they had found a convenient new source of revenue. That war alone had pushed the national debt to a figure so large it would have sounded like fiction to most ordinary households, and someone in the Treasury eventually settled on cider as an obvious, largely untaxed target ripe for correction. A tax of 4 shillings on every large cask of cider, produced backed by the power to search a suspected farmhouse without so much as a warrant, arrived in 1763 like an insult wrapped in legislation. And the cider counties, Devon, Herefordshire, Gloucestershire, Somerset among them, did not take it quietly. Riots broke out. Farmers openly resisted the government surveyors sent out to measure exactly how many acres of cider apples each household actually owned, and more than one of those unfortunate surveyors reportedly found himself briefly kidnapped by furious locals, released only once he had agreed to abandon his measurements and go home empty-handed. Imagine being the poor clerk sent down from London to count apple trees for a living, only to find yourself marched off into a barn by a group of angry farmers who had absolutely no intention of letting your paperwork determine what they owed the crown. The controversy grew large enough to help topple a sitting Prime Minister that same year, and the argument over a government agent's right to walk uninvited into a poor man's home became for a little while one of the most heated political questions in the entire country, debated in taverns and pamphlets from Cornwall clear up to London itself. One especially well-known voice in Parliament argued passionately that a man's cottage, however humble, however likely to let the wind and rain straight through its walls, ought to remain a place the king's own officers had no right to enter without permission. It took 3 full years of sustained public anger before the government finally backed down and repealed the tax in 1766. Households in the cider counties celebrated with genuine relief, some going so far as to commission special drinking glasses engraved with the words "No Excise, small defiant souvenirs of a fight." The ordinary cider drinker had actually managed to win against considerably more powerful opposition. A handful of those very glasses still survive today, tucked away in museum cabinets and private collections, small pieces of glass carrying an entire county's stubborn refusal to be pushed around quietly. Here is the detail I find most remarkable in this entire episode, and I suspect quite a few of you watching from America tonight will feel a particular little jolt of recognition when you hear it. The exact same slogan those angry cider counties used against their own government liberty property, and no excise crossed the Atlantic within a couple of years, and was picked up almost word for word by colonists protesting an entirely different piece of unwelcome legislation, a certain stamp tax you may have heard mentioned once or twice in a rather more famous story. Colonial printers even borrowed the exact same rallying language swapping stamp for cider, and finding the fit remarkably comfortable. The cider tax riots were not simply a footnote in English history. They were in a very real sense a dress rehearsal, tested first on a much smaller stage for exactly the kind of resistance that would eventually help set the American colonies on their own separate path entirely. Can I ask you something sitting with that connection for a moment? Had you ever heard before tonight that a tax on apple cider in rural England helped hand the American Revolution one of its favourite slogans? I certainly had not the first time I came across it, and I have not been able to look at a bottle of cider quite the same way since. Politics, though, was never the only force capable of quietly undoing generations of careful orchard work. There was a second threat considerably slower and less dramatic than an angry mob confronting a tax surveyor, but in its own way just as ruthless. And this one came from inside the trees themselves. Do you remember the red streak, the once celebrated cider apple we mentioned earlier this evening, prized enough in its day to help spark an entire boom in English orchards? Over the generations that followed, that same variety began quietly failing its trees, growing more and more susceptible to disease with every passing decade, and nobody at the time could fully explain why a fruit once considered nearly perfect was slowly losing its ability to simply survive. Growers tried everything sensible. Richer soil, careful pruning, more attentive care than any tree had ever received before, and still year after year, more of the old red streak orchards quietly failed to thrive the way their grandparents' orchards once had. The answer, when it eventually arrived decades later from a careful, patient scientist working with fruit trees of his own, turned out to be rather unsettling once you actually sit with it. This same scientist, a country gentleman with an unusually rigorous, methodical mind, had spent years grafting and crossbreeding new apple varieties on his own estate, and he grew increasingly convinced that something deeper than bad weather or careless neglect was responsible for the slow decline he kept observing in England's oldest, most beloved varieties. Remember what we discussed earlier tonight about grafting, how every single red streak tree in every single orchard across the country was never truly a separate individual at all, but a direct, continuous piece of that very first original tree, endlessly propagated, never once grown fresh from seed. That scientist eventually argued that a variety propagated this way, generation after generation, century after century, without ever once starting over from a new seedling, might simply be aging as a single, continuous organism growing more vulnerable to disease the same way any living thing eventually does the longer it persists. Every red streak tree anyone had ever planted was not a new life. It was the same original life stretched thinner and thinner across hundreds of years and thousands of separate trunks. I find that idea almost eerie, if I'm honest with you, and worth sitting with for a moment longer than we usually give a piece of agricultural history. Somewhere centuries ago, one single seed became one single tree, and everything cut from it, since every orchard, every cask, every family who ever grew red streak cider on their own land, was really just one very old individual, quietly slowing down the way we all eventually do. Beer, meanwhile, was mounting its own separate, considerably less poetic challenge. As brewing became more efficient and better organized commercially across this century, larger breweries able to produce consistent, reliable batches at a scale no single farmhouse cider operation could realistically match. Beer simply became easier and cheaper to produce reliably at scale than cider ever could. An orchard tree taking years to mature, standing at a permanent disadvantage against a grain crop that could be replanted and reaped again within a single season. A brewer disappointed with one year's barley could simply plant differently the following spring. A cider maker disappointed with a failing orchard faced years of patient regrafting before the problem could even begin to correct itself. Slowly, unglamorously in county after county that had once built entire local economies around the apple. Harvest, farmers began quietly grubbing out old orchards to make room for other, faster-paying uses of the same ground. There was a particular way land had traditionally been used that fell away alongside all of this too, worth mentioning because it says something honest about what gets lost when an industry modernizes. For generations, English orchards had often served two purposes at once: apple trees standing overhead while sheep or cattle grazed comfortably in the shade below the same acre of land, quietly producing fruit and livestock simultaneously, without asking either one to give up any ground. Picture it properly for a moment. Wool and mutton growing fat beneath branches heavy with next autumn's cider. Two entirely different forms of wealth sharing the exact same patch of grass, without the faintest bit of conflict between them. As cider production eventually moved toward larger, more commercially focused operations, that old generous dual-purpose arrangement increasingly gave way to orchards, planted for maximum fruit yield alone, tidy efficient rows with no room left for a grazing animal, and considerably less interesting to simply stand inside. None of this had fully arrived yet in Thomas and Eleanor's own lifetime, worth saying clearly, and I do not want to leave you thinking their particular orchard sat under any of these specific threats this exact autumn. But the pattern itself, taxation that could arrive without warning, disease that could quietly hollow out a beloved variety over generations, competition that could make an entire way of farming simply less profitable than it used to be. None of that pattern was unique to some other century safely distant from their own. It was already unfolding in pieces in the very decades this family lived through, and they would have heard the stories, discussed them over cider of their own, worried a little the way any sensible household worries about forces considerably larger than themselves. Thomas had in fact heard talk at the last market day of a neighbouring parish, where an entire hillside of old orchard had been quietly grubbed out that spring, replaced with something the landlord considered a surer bet. He had said nothing about it to Eleanor at the time, turning the thought over privately, the way he tended to turn most worries over, but she had noticed him standing a little longer than usual at the edge of their own rows that same evening and had not needed to ask why. I think there is a lesson worth carrying forward from all of this, and it is not a particularly comfortable one. Prosperity built on land patience and careful craft, the exact kind of prosperity we have spent this whole evening admiring, was never actually as stable as it looked from the outside. A single act of Parliament, a single stubborn disease, a single shift in what people preferred to drink could undo generations of grafting, planting, and careful harvest arithmetic far faster than any of it had ever been built. 6 years to raise a bearing tree, a single season for a government minister to sign a tax into law. The arithmetic of destruction, it turns out, has never once matched the arithmetic of creation in this century or in any other. Thomas and Eleanor's own orchard, healthy and generous this particular year, existed inside exactly this same fragile arrangement, whether either of them spent much time thinking about it on an ordinary autumn afternoon or not. Have you ever watched something built slowly, carefully over years come apart quickly because of a decision made somewhere far outside anyone's actual control, a policy, change, a market shift, a single piece of bad luck nobody saw coming? I suspect that particular kind of helplessness watching patient work meet an impatient world has not gone anywhere in the century since Thomas stood in his own orchard, entirely unaware of a tax bill already being drafted in a government office he would never once visit in his life. And yet, for all of that fragility, for every tax, every disease, every slow economic shift working quietly against families exactly like this one, something in this particular story still managed to survive season after season, right through to the very evening we have spent tonight walking through together. There is one final thread left to follow before we let this particular harvest and this particular family finally rest. That final thread is a quiet one, so let's let it unfold slowly the way this whole day has slowed hour by hour, ever since that first cold morning we stepped into together. There is no dramatic twist waiting at the end of this particular story, no sudden reveal to keep you holding your breath. Just an ordinary evening closing gently around an ordinary family, the way most days in most centuries actually end quietly, without anyone announcing that anything of note has happened at all. By the time the light outside had properly failed, Thomas walked the fence line one last time, checking the gate at the far end of the orchard, the same low wooden gate Eleanor had stood beside that very morning, watching her breath curl up into the dark before anyone else in the household had even stirred. The air had turned properly cold now, the kind of cold that promised an even harder frost by morning than the one that had greeted them at sunrise, and his own breath caught the last of the light the same way hers had hours earlier on the very same patch of ground. He latched it carefully the way he did every single evening of this particular week, though there was nothing left inside that orchard worth stealing tonight, beyond a handful of deliberately unpicked apples high in the oldest branches, apples nobody in this family intended to touch. Behind him, the rows stood quiet, stripped, mostly bare, patient in the way only trees know how to be patient already, in their own slow fashion beginning the long work of preparing for a spring still months away. Think for a moment about everything that single stretch of ground actually held by the time this particular day finally ended. Hands that knew exactly how to twist a ripe apple free without bruising it, and exactly how to let an unripe one wait one more day. A scar on a young tree's trunk where two separate lives had been persuaded with nothing more than a sharp blade and a steady hand to become one. A quiet, unwritten understanding about who truly kept this household's provisions safe through winter, whatever a court of law might have said about ownership on paper. A widow down the lane gathering windfalls nobody begrudged her. A bell ringing out over a debt that would soon need settling one way or another. A press, a cheeser cask now resting patiently in the dark, already beginning its slow transformation into something this family could not fully do without. Trees deliberately left a little short of empty, out of respect for something nobody could actually prove was listening. And underneath every bit of that, a fragile patient economy that history would eventually test with taxes, disease, and simple changing taste, exactly the way it tests every good thing eventually in every century without exception. All of that held inside one ordinary autumn day, inside one modest orchard, inside one family most history books would never once think to mention by name. And yet here we are, centuries later, still thinking about them, still turning their particular morning over in our minds long after their own candles have burned down to nothing. That if nothing else seems worth noticing before we let them finally rest, inside the farmhouse the evening settled into something considerably quieter than the morning had been. A fire had been built up properly in the hearth, and the household gathered close around it the way families have always gathered close around fire once the working day is finally honestly done. Eleanor poured cider from last year's cask, the one already finished, already mellowed through a full 12 months of patient waiting, into cups that still did not match one another, because in a house like this one nothing ever quite did. The bread from that morning's breakfast basket had long since been finished, replaced now by a small dish of the very first walnuts Sarah and Ned had gathered, that same afternoon cracked open and shared around the fire while the last of the daylight finally gave out entirely beyond the windows. Ned, who had spent the better part of the day eating considerably more than he collected, was already fighting a losing battle against his own eyelids, head drooping slowly toward his mother's shoulder, despite his firm insistence only minutes earlier that he was not the least bit tired. Sarah sat a little straighter than the rest, quietly proud of a day's work. She had honestly earned the kind of tiredness that settles into shoulders honestly, rather than the kind that simply wears a person down. She kept turning one particular hazelnut over in her fingers, one she had apparently decided for reasons entirely her own was worth keeping rather than eating, and nobody in the family thought to ask her why. Thomas said little as usual, though he reached over at one point and rested a hand briefly on his wife's knee, a small, wordless acknowledgement of a day well spent together, the closest thing to a proper thank you he ever seemed to need to offer out loud. Some marriages, I think, are built less on grand declarations and more on exactly this kind of quiet, repeated gesture, offered at the end of an ordinary day nobody else would ever think to write down. I want to pull back for a moment now, all the way out of that farmhouse, all the way out of that particular century, and land somewhere considerably closer to where you and I are actually sitting tonight. Most of the specific apples this family spent today sorting, pressing and setting, carefully aside for winter, no longer exist in the form they knew them. Many of England's old cider varieties, the red streak among them, along with hundreds upon hundreds of names most of us will never once encounter, in an ordinary supermarket have either vanished entirely or survived today, only inside a small handful of dedicated collections, orchards kept alive specifically because someone somewhere decided this particular piece of history was worth the trouble of preserving. One such collection, held today in the English county of Kent, quietly maintains well over 2,000 separate name varieties, living trees grafted, generation after generation, exactly the way Thomas grafted his own, a kind of museum that happens to be made entirely of orchards instead of glass cases, where visitors can walk between rows and taste apples that would otherwise exist today only as a name mentioned in passing on an evening like this one. Across the ocean, something similar has been happening in the American Pacific Northwest, where a small group of dedicated volunteers has spent recent years combing through abandoned farms and forgotten orchards searching for apple varieties everyone assumed had disappeared for good, some of them missing from record for the better part of a century. Of the many thousands of named varieties, North America once grew only a fraction remain known and identifiable today. Every so often, though one of these searchers finds a single old tree half wild, half forgotten, growing quietly on some overgrown hillside behind a collapsed barn or an abandoned homestead, and discovers it still carries a variety nobody alive had tasted in 100 years, sometimes confirmed only after careful comparison against old nursery catalogues and faded written descriptions. It is in its own small way exactly the same patient, hopeful work Thomas performed every single time he grafted a new sapling, betting on a future he would not fully live to see, except now the bet runs the other direction, entirely reaching backward instead of forward, trying to recover a past that very nearly slipped away for good. There is something rather moving in that I think if you let yourself sit with it for a moment before we close this particular story. An orchard properly kept was never simply about this year's harvest. It was always a conversation stretched across generations, planted by people who would never taste their own tree's best years, tended by people inheriting work they did not begin, occasionally rescued centuries later, by people determined not to let a single patient hard-won variety simply vanish from the world because nobody bothered to keep asking. Thomas never met the person who planted the oldest tree in his own orchard. The volunteers combing those Pacific Northwest hillsides today will likely never meet the long-dead farmer who first grafted the tree they eventually find. And yet the thread holds anyway, passed hand to hand across centuries by people who mostly never overlapped in a single lifetime, connected only by the same patient. Stubborn belief that some things are worth keeping alive regardless of who gets to enjoy the reward. Maybe that is worth carrying with you tonight as you drift off wherever you happen to be listening from. Something you plant quite literally or otherwise patiently without much fanfare rarely announces its own importance while you are the one doing the planting. Its value tends to reveal itself considerably later in hands you may never actually meet, belonging to people who will simply be grateful without necessarily knowing your name that you bothered to start in the first place. A recipe passed down without ceremony. A kindness extended to a neighbour who never quite finds the words to properly repay it. A skill taught patiently to a child who will not appreciate it fully for another 20 years. We are most of us planting orchards of one kind or another all the time, usually without even noticing we have picked up the shovel. Back in that farmhouse, one by one, the household finally gave in to the day. Ned was carried up first, already half asleep, before his head properly reached the pillow, one fist still faintly curled, as though it expected to find another hazelnut waiting inside it. Sarah followed not long after, still faintly smiling about something nobody else had heard. That single kept hazelnut tucked safely into the pocket of her apron, for reasons she likely could not have fully explained herself, even if asked directly. Eleanor banked the fire low enough warmth left to greet the morning, without wasting the wood they had worked so hard to secure, and paused briefly at the bottom of the stairs, listening to the particular quiet a house makes once every single person inside it is finally properly asleep. And Thomas, last as always, stood a moment longer at the window, looking out toward an orchard he could no longer really see in the dark, trusting it regardless. The way you trust anything you have tended carefully enough for long enough to finally stop worrying about every single night. Somewhere out past that window, the bell that would soon call this family to their Michaelmas reckoning sat quietly waiting its turn. And beyond that a winter, and beyond that without any doubt at all, another spring, another blossom, another slow, patient season, exactly like the one we have spent tonight walking through together. Because that in the end is really what an orchard is, not one harvest. A conversation with time itself repeated every single year, for as long as somebody remains willing to keep having it. The wassail would come whether or not anyone remembered exactly why. The grafting would continue one careful cut at a time. The apples would be sorted again the same way by hands that had learned it, from hands that learned it from hands nobody in this family could name anymore, and somewhere quietly, without any fanfare at all, the whole long patient story would simply begin once more. Thank you honestly for spending this time with me tonight, and for letting this particular orchard, this particular family, and this particular quiet corner of history keep you company for as long as it has. Stories like this one only really work when somebody is willing to slow down long enough to actually listen, and I am grateful you were that somebody this evening. If you found your way here a little restless, I hope you leave a little softer than you arrived. Rest well wherever you are. And whenever you are ready to return, there is another story waiting patiently for you somewhere just past the edge of tonight, the same way this orchard waited quietly and without complaint for spring.